ร้อมครับสวัสดีค่ะสวัสดีแขกท่านผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านค่ะขอต้อนรับทุกท่านเข้าสู่งานสัมมนาในหัวข้อ Development of Circular Economy Investment Promotion Policy and Action Plan in the Eastern Economic Corridor in Thailand ซึ่งรูปแบบของการสัมมนาค่ะจะเป็นแบบไฮบริดโดยมีวิทยากรและผู้ร่วมงานสัมมนาณโรงแรม W Hotel แห่งนี้และเรายังมีการถ่ายทอดไปยังผู้เข้าร่วมสัมมนาทั่วโลกผ่านระบบ Zoom Webinar ที่ทุกท่านได้ทำการลงทะเบียนเป็นที่เรียบร้อยค่ะดิฉันภักวรณิชจิรชัยภาคินกุลหรือชาชาค่ะได้รับเกียรติให้ทำหน้าที่พิธีกรในวันนี้อยู่กับทุกท่านตั้งแต่บัดนี้เป็นต้นไปจนจบการสัมมนาค่ะงานสัมมนาในวันนี้ค่ะเกิดขึ้นโดยความร่วมมือจาก2องค์กรสำคัญองค์กรแรกคือสำนักงานคณะกรรมการนโยบายเขตพัฒนาพิเศษภาคตะวันออกหรือสกพอ.ซึ่งทำหน้าที่ส่งเสริมการลงทุนยกระดับนวัตกรรมและพัฒนาเทคโนโลยีขั้นสูงในประเทศไทยซึ่งแน่นอนค่ะนอกจากจะอำนวยความสะดวกด้านการติดต่อดำเนินงานธุรกิจตลอดระยะเวลาของโครงการแล้วยังประสานงานอย่างใกล้ชิดกับหน่วยงานภาครัฐและภาคเอกชนอื่นๆเพื่อให้มั่นใจว่าโครงการนั้นจะประสบความสำเร็จทั้งนี้เพื่อพัฒนา EEC ให้เป็นพื้นที่ต้นแบบที่มีการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจสังคมและสิ่งแวดล้อมอย่างเป็นระบบค่ะอีกหนึ่งองค์กรที่สำคัญค่ะได้แก่ ERM ซึ่งเป็นบริษัทที่ปรึกษาด้านความยั่งยืนที่ใหญ่ที่สุดแห่งหนึ่งของโลกโดยทำงานร่วมกับองค์กรชั้นนำต่างๆมากมายเพื่อสรรสร้างนวัตกรรมที่ตอบสนองต่อความท้าทายด้านความยั่งยืนและสรรหาโอกาสทางธุรกิจที่ตอบสนองต่อความต้องการในปัจจุบันและโอกาสทางธุรกิจสำหรับยุคอนาคตค่ะ ERM ประกอบไปด้วยทีมผู้เชี่ยวชาญจากหลากหลายสาขากว่า 7,000 คนทำงานในกว่า150สำนักงานกระจายอยู่กว่า40ประเทศทั่วโลกค่ะที่ทำหน้าที่สนับสนุนการดำเนินงานขององค์กรต่างๆเพื่อมุ่งสู่ความยั่งยืนก่อนที่เราจะเริ่มเข้าสู่เนื้อหาของการสัมมนาในวันนี้ขอชี้แจงถึง House Rules ดังนี้ค่ะเราอยากให้ผู้ร่วมงานทุกท่านค่ะได้มีส่วนร่วมกับงานสัมมนาในวันนี้สำหรับผู้ที่กำลังรับชมผ่านทางออนไลน์ค่ะทุกท่านสามารถโพสต์คำถามผ่านทางกล่องสนทนาหรือแชทบ็อกซ์ตรงด้านล่างสุดของหน้าจอได้ตลอดเวลาค่ะและสำหรับผู้ที่ร่วมสัมมนาในงานแห่งนี้ค่ะท่านสามารถยกมือขึ้นเพื่อร่วมถามคำถามในช่วง Q&A ซึ่งเราจะมีช่วงนี้แทรกอยู่ตลอดการสัมมนาในวันนี้โดยขอเรียนแจ้งให้ทุกท่านทราบว่าการสัมมนาในวันนี้ค่ะจะได้รับการบันทึกไว้และนำมาใช้ในกิจกรรมภายในของ ERM เท่านั้นส่วน Presentation ค่ะถ้าทุกท่านอยากจะได้เข้าชมรายละเอียดเพิ่มเติมสามารถเข้าดูได้หลังจากจบการจัดงานค่ะงานสัมมนาในวันนี้เราจะดำเนินรายการทั้งภาคภาษาไทยและภาคภาษาอังกฤษค่ะโดยเราจะมีล่ามผู้แปลภาษาตลอดงานสำหรับทางช่องทางออนไลน์ทุกท่านสามารถรับฟังเสียงภาษาไทยหรือภาษาอังกฤษได้โดยการเลือกภาษาที่ต้องการตรงปุ่มไอคอนลูกโลกบนหน้าจอสำหรับผู้ที่เข้าร่วมงานที่นี่ค่ะสามารถขอชุดหูฟังได้บริเวณด้านหน้างานค่ะและสำหรับท่านไหนที่มีคำแนะนำนะคะหรือว่าข้อสงสัยเพิ่มเติมเกี่ยวกับการจัดงานในครั้งนี้ท่านสามารถให้คำแนะนำและติชมได้ในแบบสำรวจความคิดเห็นสั้นๆตอนท้ายงานของเราค่ะและเพื่อความปลอดภัยของผู้ร่วมงานทุกท่านค่ะขอให้ทุกท่านสวมใส่หน้ากากอนามัยตลอดการสัมมนาในวันนี้และให้ทุกท่านสังเกตทางหนีไฟใกล้ที่นั่งของท่านในบริเวณการจัดงานเพื่อความปลอดภัยค่ะชี้แจงกำหนดการคร่าวๆนะคะสำหรับการสัมมนาในวันนี้ในช่วงเช้าอีกสักครู่ค่ะเราจะมีพิธีการกล่าวเปิดงานอย่างเป็นทางการโดยท่านประธานในพิธีค่ะหลังจากนั้นจะเป็นเซสชั่นของการแนะนำโครงการและการปฏิบัติงานการนำเสนอกลยุทธ์และแผนการดำเนินงานสำหรับภาค Bio-Base ค่ะและจะพัก Coffee Break ประมาณ15นาทีกลับมากับอีกหนึ่งหัวข้อคือการนำเสนอกลยุทธ์และแผนการดำเนินงานสำหรับภาคการผลิตค่ะและช่วงบ่ายเป็นอีกหนึ่งเซสชั่นที่น่าสนใจค่ะนั่นคือการนำเสนอกลยุทธ์และแผนการดำเนินงานสำหรับภาคบริการและไลฟ์สไตล์นั่นเองค่ะ ซึ่งแน่นอนนะคะอยากจะให้ทุกท่านได้ติดตามอยู่กับเราทั้ง2ช่วงทั้งภาคเช้าและภาคบ่ายเลยทีเดียวในช่วงที่ผ่านมาค่ะทุกภาคส่วนได้ให้ความสำคัญกับหลักเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนหรือ Circular Economy มากขึ้นและในการสัมมนาวันนี้ทุกท่านจะได้รับฟังคำนำเสนอกลยุทธ์แผนการดำเนินงานและแนวนโยบายการส่งเสริมการลงทุนในภาคส่วนเฉพาะเพื่อให้องค์กรต่างๆค่ะได้รับรู้ถึงการเปลี่ยนแปลงหรือว่าสิ่งใหม่ๆที่เกิดขึ้นและนำมาพัฒนาค่ะในเขตพัฒนาพิเศษภาคตะวันออกนั่นเองลำดับแรกค่ะเรียนเชิญทุกท่านรับฟังการกล่าวเปิดงานโดยท่านประธานในพิธีท่านสุขุมสมประสงค์ค่ะท่านเป็นผู้อำนวยการสำนักยุทธศาสตร์และชักชวนการลงทุนสำนักงานคณะกรรมการนโยบายเขตพัฒนาพิเศษภาคตะวันออกหรือสกพอซึ่งท่านสุขุมได้มีประสบการณ์ค่ะรวมไปถึงผลงานในฐานะนักการทูตของกระทรวงต่างประเทศท่านได้เดินทางไปประจำณสถานทูตต่างๆทั่วโลกค่ะนอกจากนี้ท่านยังมีบทบาทสำคัญด้านเศรษฐกิจระหว่างประเทศรวมถึงหอการค้าไทยและสภาหอการค้าแห่งประเทศไทยซึ่งสอดคล้องกับภารกิจของท่านที่สกพอในฐานะผู้อำนวยการสำนักยุทธศาสตร์และชักชวนการลงทุนอีกด้วยค่ะถ้าพร้อมแล้วค่ะเรียนเชิญทุกท่านพบกับท่านสุขุมสมประสงค์ค่ะ
ท่านผู้ร่วมการสัมมนาที่เคารพทุกท่านครับในโลกทุกวันนี้ไม่มีใครที่จะปฏิเสธเรื่องเศรษฐกิจสีเขียวและอุตสาหกรรมสีเขียวอุตสาหกรรมหมุนเวียนได้นะฮะไม่ว่าทุกประเทศในโลกนี้ต่างก็มีนโยบายที่จะสนับสนุนการลดการปล่อยคาร์บอนไดออกไซด์ยกตัวอย่างเช่นในอเมริกาก็มี US Climate Strategyใน EU มี EU Green Deal แล้วก็ในญี่ปุ่นก็มี Green Growth Strategy แม้กระทั่งในประเทศไทยเราเองก็มีแผนพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจและสังคมแห่งชาติฉบับที่13และในจีนแม้กระทั่งในจีนนะครับก็จะมีแผนพัฒนา5ปีที่กล่าวถึงเศรษฐกิจสีเขียวและอุตสาหกรรมสีเขียว EEC ก็เช่นเดียวกันซึ่งเป็นโมเดลการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจในพื้นที่ที่เน้นการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจในเทคโนโลยีชั้นสูงซึ่งเราจะปฏิเสธจะไม่ได้ว่าเราจะต้องเป็นผู้นำในการพัฒนาอุตสาหกรรมสีเขียวอุตสาหกรรมหมุนเวียนด้วยเหตุนี้จึงได้ร่วมมือกับ ERM ซึ่งเป็นผู้นำองค์กรหนึ่งในด้านพัฒนาอุตสาหกรรมสีเขียวนี่นะครับในการที่ออกแบบ กรอบนโยบายแล้วก็ action plans เพื่อจะจูงใจชักจูงนักลงทุนให้มาลงทุนในด้านนี้ซึ่งในการสัมมนาในวันนี้ผมหวังใจว่าจะเป็นประโยชน์ต่อผู้เข้าร่วมสัมมนาทุกท่านซึ่งจะได้รับทราบถึงร่างแนวนโยบายและแผนปฏิบัติการที่ได้จัดทำมาอย่างยากลำบากและลงไปในรายละเอียดนะฮะในเซกชันต่างๆเช่นไบโอการผลิตแล้วก็ไลฟ์สไตล์ซึ่งผู้ร่วมสัมมนาในวันนี้สามารถที่จะนำข้อมูลและแนวคิดไปปรับใช้ในธุรกิจและอุตสาหกรรมของท่านในระดับชาติในขณะเดียวกันทาง EEC ก็จะยินดีที่จะได้รับคำแนะนำความเห็นของผู้ร่วมสัมมนาทุกท่านมาปรับแก้แนวนโยบายและ Action Plan ที่นำเสนอในวันนี้ก็จะเป็นประโยชน์ต่อทั้งสองฝ่ายในโอกาสนี้กับผมขอขอบคุณที่ท่านได้มาร่วมการสัมมนาในวันนี้หวังว่าก็จะได้ประโยชน์ทั้งผู้ที่มาร่วมสัมมนาและผู้จัดนะครับก็ได้เวลาที่จะต้องขอกล่าวเปิดการสัมมนาขอขอบคุณครับ
กราบขอบพระคุณท่านสุขุมสมประสงค์ค่ะท่านผู้อำนวยการสำนักยุทธศาสตร์และชักชวนการลงทุนสำนักคณะกรรมการนโยบายเขตพัฒนาพิเศษภาคตะวันออกหรือสกพอนั่นเองค่ะวันนี้ท่านให้เกียรติมาเป็นประธานในพิธีสำหรับการกล่าวต้อนรับอย่างเป็นทางการค่ะในลำดับถัดไปค่ะเพื่อให้ทุกท่านได้เข้าใจถึงนโยบายการพัฒนาแผนส่งเสริมการลงทุนในเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนและแผนการดำเนินงานในเขตพัฒนาพิเศษภาคตะวันออกรวมไปถึงวัตถุประสงค์ของการจัดงานในวันนี้ค่ะขอเชิญพบกับคุณนัทวานิชชยางกูลกรรมการผู้จัดการบริษัท ERM สยามจำกัดขอเรียนเชิญค่ะ
ขอขอบคุณผอ.สุขุมสมประสงค์นะครับผู้อำนวยการสำนักยุทธศาสตร์และชักชวนการลงทุนของ EEC นะครับผมนัทวรรณชยางกูลครับเป็นกรรมการผู้จัดการของ ERM นะครับก็ได้รับเกียรติวันนี้นะครับมาพูดให้ฟังเบื้องต้นนะครับเกี่ยวกับที่มาของโครงการนะครับโครงการนี้นะครับหลักๆก็คือเราต้องการจะส่งเสริมสนับสนุนนะครับให้เกิดการลงทุนในเรื่องของ Circular Economy หรือเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนนะครับโดยใช้พื้นที่ EEC นะครับเป็นพื้นที่นำร่องนะครับแน่นอนครับว่าในการทำเรื่องนี้เนี่ยมันก็จะมีประเด็นไม่ว่าจะเป็นในส่วนของอุปสรรคนะครับความท้าทายนะครับแล้วก็โอกาสในการดำเนินธุรกิจนะครับก็การศึกษาครั้งนี้นะครับก็ได้ความร่วมมือจากหลายกลุ่มของผู้มีส่วนได้ส่วนเสียนะครับทั้งในทางภาครัฐนะครับภาคเอกชนนะครับแล้วก็ทางภาคสังคมนะครับโดยขอขอบคุณนะครับสำหรับผู้มีส่วนได้ส่วนเสียสำหรับทุกๆกลุ่มนะครับในพื้นที่ของ EEC นะครับก็อย่างที่เราทราบดีนะครับเป็นพื้นที่ใน3จังหวัดของเมืองไทยนะครับไม่ว่าจะเป็นระยองชลบุรีแล้วก็ฉะเชิงเทรานะครับ3พื้นที่นี้ไม่ใช่เป็น3พื้นที่ที่เป็นกรีนฟิลด์นะครับก็มีอุตสาหกรรมที่เป็นอุตสาหกรรมที่พูดง่ายๆว่ามีเทคโนโลยีในระดับสูงนะครับอยู่แล้วนะครับแล้วก็เป็นพื้นที่ที่มีในส่วนของอินฟราสตรัคเจอร์ที่สมบูรณ์แบบนะครับแล้วก็อีกเรื่องหนึ่งที่สำคัญของในพื้นที่ EEC คือเรื่องของ connectivity หรือการเชื่อมต่อนะครับไม่ว่าจะเป็นในระบบขนส่งนะครับหรือในเรื่องของตัว digital technology นะครับก็ด้วยเหตุนี้เองนะครับเราก็คิดว่าพื้นที่นี้น่าจะเป็นพื้นที่ที่สามารถทำเป็น regulatory sandbox นะครับหรืออาจจะเป็นพื้นที่ที่นำร่องได้นะครับในการนำระบบเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนนะครับหรือที่เราเรียกกันว่าBCG นะครับก็คือ Bioeconomy Circular Economy แล้วก็ Green Economy นะครับซึ่งเป็นพื้นฐานหลักนะครับของการที่จะไปสู่ Thailand 4.0 นะครับมาใช้เป็นพื้นที่นำร่องนะครับแล้วก็แน่นอนครับว่านโยบายวันนี้นะครับที่เราจะนำเสนอนะครับหรือ Action Plan ที่เราจะนำเสนอนั้นก็จะมีอยู่ด้วยกัน2 ส่วนนะครับส่วนแรกก็คือจะเป็น Action Plan แล้วก็จะเป็นกลยุทธ์ที่เข้าไปสนับสนุนส่งเสริมธุรกิจที่มีอยู่แล้วในพื้นที่นะครับกับอีกส่วนหนึ่งก็คือเป็น Action Plan หรือเป็นกลยุทธ์ที่จะเข้าไปสนับสนุนส่งเสริมการลงทุนนะครับที่ใหม่ๆที่จะเข้ามาในพื้นที่ EEC นะครับเพราะฉะนั้นก็จะมีทั้ง2 ส่วนนะครับในส่วนของการดำเนินงานนะครับในขอบเขตของโครงการนะครับก็จะครอบคลุมทั้ง10 อุตสาหกรรมเป้าหมายของ EEC นะครับโดยแบ่ง10 อุตสาหกรรมเป้าหมายของ EEC นั้นออกเป็น3 คลัสเตอร์หลักๆนะครับเราไม่ได้ทำ Circular Economy Value Chain ในแต่ละอุตสาหกรรมเพราะมันจะซ้ำซ้อนกันเราจับเป็นคลัสเตอร์ทั้งหมด3 คลัสเตอร์นะครับคลัสเตอร์แรกก็คือเป็นส่วนของตัว Bio Base นะครับหรือ Bioeconomyตัว Biotechnology ทั้งหลายนะครับแล้วก็คลัสเตอร์ที่2จะเป็นในมิติของ Manufacturing นะครับโดยเอาดิจิทัลนะครับไม่ว่าจะเป็น EV เข้ามารวมอยู่ด้วยกันนะครับแล้วก็คลัสเตอร์ที่3จะเป็นในมิติของ Service นะครับก็คือไม่ว่าจะเป็นในเรื่องของตัว medical tourism นะครับหรือเป็นตัว medical and healthcare ทั้งหลายนะครับก็จะเป็น3เซกเตอร์นี้ 3คลัสเตอร์นี้นะครับคราวนี้มาดูผมว่าหลักๆนะครับจากผลการศึกษาเนี่ยแน่นอนนะว่าไอ้ตัว Biofuel หรือ Biochemical เนี่ยมันเป็นจุดได้เปรียบของประเทศไทยนะครับจะบอกว่าได้เปรียบก็ได้เปรียบนะครับแต่ถ้าไม่ทำให้ดีก็อาจจะเสียเปรียบนะฮะเพราะว่าจริงๆแล้วเนี่ย agribusiness ของเราเนี่ยค่อนข้างเรามีค่อนข้างเยอะนะครับแล้วแน่นอนครับอีกหน่อยถ้าเราดูในมิติของพลังงานในมิติของเคมีภัณฑ์หรือในมิติของแม้กระทั่งอุตสาหกรรมการพูดง่ายๆว่าเป็นในส่วนของยานะครับเวชภัณฑ์เนี่ยไบโอนะครับหรือพืชการเกษตรเนี่ยก็จะเป็น Feedstock หลักนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นในกรณีที่ถ้าเราสามารถทำให้ตัว agribusiness ของเราเนี่ยนะครับมันมีเทคโนโลยีที่ถูกต้องนะครับแล้วสามารถพัฒนาได้อย่างไม่ไปมีผลกระทบต่อสิ่งแวดล้อมและสังคมในภาพรวมนะครับนั่นหมายความว่าเราก็สามารถทำไม่ว่าจะเป็น Biofuel ซึ่งวันนี้เราทำอยู่แล้วนะครับแต่สามารถต่อยอดเป็น Biochemical Biopharma พวกนี้ได้นะครับแล้วก็อันนั้นนะครับคือ Thailand 4.0 เป็นอุตสาหกรรมที่เราต้องการสนับสนุนส่งเสริมในส่วนของเทคโนโลยี Innovative Collaboration นั้นนะครับจากการสัมภาษณ์ผู้มีส่วนได้ส่วนเสียเนี่ยแน่นอนครับว่าตอนนี้เป็นจุดที่ทุกคนอยากจะได้ทุกคนอยากจะได้รับความร่วมมือแล้วก็การสนับสนุนส่งเสริมก็คือในฝั่งของ upstream ในมิติของเทคโนโลยีในมิติของวิจัยพัฒนานะครับเพื่อทำให้ยกตัวอย่างเช่นแบตเตอรี่ในวันนี้มันสามารถเป็นแบตเตอรี่ที่สามารถเอาไปใช้ในเทคโนโลยีในอนาคตได้นะครับอีกส่วนหนึ่งก็คือในเรื่องของตัวsupply chain นะครับวันนี้ถ้าเราจะสนับสนุนในตัว Green Economy นะครับต้องยอมรับว่าเราต้องไม่ใช่เฉพาะผู้ประกอบการรายใหญ่นะฮะที่จะต้อง Green พอผู้ประกอบการรายใหญ่มี Commitment นะครับหรือมี Action Plan ในเรื่องของ Green แล้วเนี่ยสิ่งที่ตามมาก็คือในเรื่องของตัว supply chain นะครับก็จะต้อง Green ด้วยนะครับไม่งั้น Ecosystem มันเป็น Ecosystem แบบ Net Zero ไม่ได้นะครับก็อันนี้ก็เป็นส่วนหนึ่งครับในเรื่องของ decarbonization ว่าตัว operation ใหญ่ๆหรือบริษัทใหญ่ๆไม่น่าจะมีปัญหาแต่จะทำอย่างไรให้ supply chain ในที่เกี่ยวข้องกับไม่ว่าจะเป็น supply หรือ logistics ของสินค้าและบริการนะครับมันกรีนด้วยนะครับอันนี้ก็ไม่ใช่เรื่องง่ายนะครับแต่ก็เป็นเรื่องที่เราต้องสนับสนุนส่งเสริมต่อไปนะครับแล้วก็สุดท้ายครับก็คือในมิติของตัว Service Industry นะครับซึ่งเป็นพูดง่ายๆว่าเป็นจุดเด่นของอุตสาหกรรมในประเทศไทยนะครับเราจะต่อยอดอุตสาหกรรมนี้อย่างไรแน่นอนครับว่า Circular Economy นั้นก็จะมีบทบาทที่เข้ามาช่วยในเรื่องของตัวแนวคิดนะครับไม่ว่าจะทำให้ไอ้ตัว utilization ของfacility ของเราเหล่านั้นมันดีขึ้นนะครับก็คือพูดง่ายมี occupancy ที่สูงขึ้นนะครับหรือเอา circular economy นั้นเข้ามาใช้ในเรื่องของตัว resource recovery ก็คือ waste management หรือตัว waste to value นะครับอันนี้ก็จะเป็น4 มิติหลักๆนะครับจากผลการศึกษาของเราซึ่งเดี๋ยววันนี้ผู้เชี่ยวชาญของเราจะอธิบายในรายละเอียดนะครับช่วยเปลี่ยนสไลด์ต่อไปนะครับขอบคุณครับตัวหนึ่งที่ลืมไม่ได้นะครับก็คือ EEC นะครับหรือ Eastern Economic Corridor of Innovation นะครับหลังจากที่เราเข้าไปสัมผัสกับ EEC นะครับหลังจากที่เราเข้าไปคุยกับผู้ประกอบการนะครับเราพบว่า EECI โดยการสนับสนุนของสวทช.มีส่วนสำคัญมากนะครับแล้วก็เป็นหัวใจหลักนะครับที่จะทำให้อุตสาหกรรมของเราไปได้ทั้ง value chain นะครับไม่ใช่เฉพาะมีแต่ปลายน้ำนะครับแต่มีต้นน้ำด้วยยกตัวอย่างเช่นผมว่าอุตสาหกรรมปิโตรเคมีของเราที่เกิดขึ้นในประเทศไทยนะครับแน่นอนครับว่ามันเป็นอุตสาหกรรมที่เป็น heavy industry นะครับแต่สังเกตดูสิ่งที่เราขาดจริงๆเลยคือในเรื่องของ knowledge แล้วก็ know how นะครับแต่สิ่งที่สำคัญสำหรับการที่จะทำให้เกิดไอ้ตัว BCG โมเดลได้นะครับแล้วเราเข้าสู่ Thailand 4.0 ได้จริงๆเนี่ยผมว่าเราจะเห็นว่า EECI เนี่ยเป็นสะพานที่สำคัญในการเชื่อมต่อระหว่าง Pilot Scale ของอุตสาหกรรมที่เขาทำกันอยู่ในวันนี้นะครับไปยัง Commercial Scale นะครับอันนี้ก็จะเป็นบทบาทหลักของ EECI นะครับซึ่งในรายละเอียดของ EECI เดี๋ยววันนี้ก็อาจจะมีการนำเสนออีกครั้งหนึ่งในแต่ละ Hotspot ที่เรานำเสนอในเรื่องของกลยุทธ์นะครับขอสไลด์ต่อไปครับครับอันนี้น่าจะเป็นสไลด์สุดท้ายสำหรับผมนะครับก็จะขอกล่าวถึงตัววัตถุประสงค์หลักนะครับของวันนี้นะครับก็จะมีการสอบถามนะครับผู้รับฟังไม่ว่าจะเป็นออนไซต์นะครับหรือออนไลน์นะครับให้ช่วยให้ข้อเสนอแนะเพิ่มเติมนะครับว่าแนวนโยบายของเรานั้นที่ศึกษามาเป็นแนวนโยบายที่ปฏิบัติได้จริงไหมนะครับหรือยังขาดตกบกพร่องอะไรไปหรือเปล่านะครับเพื่อเราจะนำความคิดเห็นของท่านนั้นมาวิเคราะห์สังเคราะห์แล้วก็ทำตัว Final Study ของเรานะครับในลำดับต่อไปนะครับสำหรับวันนี้ขอบคุณมากครับ
ขอบพระคุณเป็นอย่างสูงค่ะคุณนัทวานิชยางกูลค่ะกรรมการผู้จัดการบริษัท ERM สยามจำกัดค่ะและในลำดับถัดไปค่ะสำหรับเซสชันแรกในวันนี้ค่ะทุกท่านจะได้พบกับคุณรติพัฒชยาค่ะ Principal Consultant จาก ERM ซึ่งจะมานำเสนอค่ะในเรื่องของภาพรวมการศึกษาและกลยุทธ์และแผนการดำเนินงานเพื่อขับเคลื่อนการลงทุนในเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนสำหรับภาค Bio-based ค่ะ Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Rati Patashaya, the Principal Consultant of ERM, please.
Thank you very much. So with that introduction from Kunat, I will start off with giving you a quick overview of our approach and what methodology we adopted for this program. Considering the 10 industrial sectors of EEC, when we started our program, we looked at a very long list of all the circularity hotspots that may impact the 10 industrial sectors. This long list of hotspots is shown on the slide at the one side. However, for EEC to prioritize their impact on these circularity hotspots, it was very essential for us to also create a prioritization matrix. To do this prioritization, ERM adopted a 2x2 matrix which focused on two axes. The first axis, which was the x-axis, looked at the circularity impact of each of these hotspots, which basically combined these hotspots to compare the impact in context of the global standards and also in context of Thailand's BCG 4.0 principles. The y-axis, on the other hand, looked at the EEC impact, which meant what can EEC actually do in this context of these hotspots with the change of policies, creating new infrastructure and supply chain. Bringing these two scores together, we were able to create a prioritization coming to 7 key hotspots and 1 additional hotspot, which was the 8th one, which is a common hotspot across all industries. Today, for our presentation, all the speakers will be taking you through the details of each of these hotspots. To give you a quick summary, the first 2 hotspots are essentially focused on the bio-based industries, which are the sustainable feedstock production and valorizing of bio-waste residues. The next 2, which is battery management and end-of-life material recovery, or what we can call as end-of-life extension for different products in the aviation and automotive sector, is focused on the manufacturing industry. The green data centers and waste management are also an impact in the manufacturing sector, extending to the digital sector, which is also coming up pretty big in Thailand. And finally, renewable energy and value chain emissions are cross-cutting across all industries. Before we go on to the details of each of these hotspots, I would like to pause for a minute now and take your feedback about these 7 hotspots that we talked about. You will now be invited to go into a Mentimeter poll. I'll request if you can access your phones now. Open menti.com and enter the code as listed on the screen. You will be directed to your first question. Alternatively, you can also scan the QR code as given on the screen. The first question where we need your feedback is as follows. Please rank the hotspots that we just talked about in terms of the highest impact that EEC can make and the circularity impact that you see from these different hotspots. So essentially, we are asking you to rate these hotspots on the X and the Y axis. We'll give it a few minutes. Please try and rate for all the hotspots. Take your time because this is the first Menti question and a little complex. Great. I think some initial results are starting to come in. We'll give it a few more minutes. Okay. Interesting. Definitely seeing a shift. We'll give it one more minute for more responses to start coming in, and then we will move on to discussing each one of these. We have a pretty large audience on the Zoom link as well. Please try and put your votes as well. Okay, so based on the initial results that are coming in, and I think more would be coming in as we speak, it looks like renewable energy is definitely one of the top hotspots that the audience here feels would have a circularity impact as well as EEC to change in the coming years. The next few are the value chain emissions. Of course, it's a contributing factor. It's one hotspot which is relevant to all the 10 industries. All the 10 industries within EEC's focus for the S5 and the new S5 will have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Sustainable fuels, in fact, that's very important given the AEDP plans that are coming up, and we'll talk in more details in the very next section. And it looks like waste management, in fact, waste management would also be linked to how biofuels can be enhanced for production. And e-waste management are looking at some of the top hotspots, followed by data centers and sustainable feedstock production. Great. I think your feedback and voting results are very close to how we have also evaluated and voted this. So let's move to covering the first section of our presentation. Okay, so to summarize, as we look at these 7 hotspots plus the common hotspot, it is important to note that none of these hotspots are a specific hotspot to a specific industry. The way we have done this assessment is that we have looked at an impact across the 10 industries. So for example, if you consider the sustainable feedstock and valorizing residues, which are very much relevant to the bio-based industries, you would also see a tick under aviation and logistics, which basically means that the bio-based fuels or the sustainable aviation fuels have a direct impact on how sustainable feedstock production happens. Hence, it is not just relevant to bio-based industries, but it also has an impact on how aviation and logistic industries will enhance in the future. Similarly, if you look at battery management and end-of-life material recovery, they have an impact across mobility as well as digital sector, because batteries will be used in the digital and the e-waste management will be a common topic across those two segments. Data centers, waste management also has a cross impact across mobility, smart mobility, digital, as well as service and lifestyle. And plus, the renewable energy, which is a cross-cutting, so renewable energy as a hotspot impacts all these 10 industries, and value chain emissions is an output that comes across all the 10 industries. So to summarize, the hotspots and the circularity aspects that we have looked at is a cross-industrial view, and it is not that we are looking at only a specific industry or a specific hotspot. The way we look at sustainable feedstock production will definitely advance the bio-based industries, but will also have an impact on smart mobility. In terms of the gap assessment, and you will see the reference to gap assessment in every section by each speaker, we looked at 8 gap assessment pillars or success factors. These covered business strategy. What will be the key business strategies, the new business strategies that need to be incorporated by the public and the private sector to implement circularity? Processes, how would the processes change, for example, around waste collection and waste management? What will be the policies, incentives, frameworks, regulatory rebates, tax incentives that need to come in to promote circularity for all these industries? What kind of infrastructure needs to be built? What kind of socioeconomic culture needs to be in place to change the consumer behavior to move from a linear economy to a circular economy? What technology innovations need to come in place? How would the supply chain connect with each other? And finally, how would the public-private sector collaborate for partnerships across all levels and industries? So we have adopted these 8 pillars for our gap assessment. And throughout the study, you will see references to these 8 pillars in terms of understanding the current status and towards moving to a circular economy based on Thailand BCG 4.0. This is a quick snapshot of how the gap assessment will look like. We have used 3 levels of maturity for each of the clusters and across each of the 8 dimensions. The first level, which is indicated here in red, indicates an evolving nature, which reflects a beginning status of most of the policy frameworks, incentives, infrastructure, and supply chain for the respective hotspot as against the industry. The amber, or the strengthening state, refers to policies, incentives, or infrastructure which are fast moving within Thailand. It refers to places or hotspots which already have an investment in place, a policy in place, and there is an increasing amount of public-private partnerships happening for these specific hotspots. Finally, established or the green status, these are indicative of mature policies in place in Thailand and within EEC to promote the specific hotspot. However, these would also need further sustenance as we move along. Finally, as we look at the circular economy framework, it was important to define the pillars or the enabling elements that EEC would look at for promoting circular economy. Here, because circular economy is a worldwide best practice, we looked at international best practices and we created 4 pillars in specific context of EEC and Thailand. The first one focuses on design for circularity. This pillar is essentially talking about redesigning business practices, business models to consider circularity right in the beginning of creating a manufacturing setup, a supply chain, or infrastructure. Design for Circularity focuses on regenerative resources, working with the right material, and most importantly, extending the life cycle of a given material. The second one is focusing on rethinking the business models. This basically promotes creating economic incentives, rewards, and mechanisms to support circularity for new businesses. The third, and probably the most important, is promoting collaboration. This is one area that EEC would be most instrumental in by creating public-private partnerships for more transparent collaborations for circular economy implementation. And finally, last but not the least, would be how circularity would be tech-enabled through digital online platforms, connectivity, to connect supply chains, create transparency, and bring more agility for implementation of circular economy. With that, I would like to move into our first segment for bio-based sector. Because the bio-based industry is so vast and is such a huge area, for every segment that we considered for hotspot evaluation and circularity definition, we first began our exercise by creating what we call the value chain map. Unfortunately, today only linear value chains exist. And linear value chains typically look at input all the way to end of life with no circularity in place. For each of these linear value chains, for each segment, we reviewed various themes covering resources, energy, emissions, water, waste generation, and what are the inefficiencies that currently exist within this linear value chain. As you would see here from a very summarized version for the bio-based sector, there are various inefficiencies right at the beginning, which is at the feedstock production, where there is lack of demand-supply balance between how much feedstock needs to be produced versus how much bioethanol production is happening in the country. At the biorefinery or the manufacturing level, there is again inefficiencies in context of how the resource efficiencies need to take place within biorefinery setup, how the energy and the emissions model need to be balanced with increasing growth in biorefineries. And finally, at the end consumer level and the end of life, there is practically no implementation of valorizing residues, bio-waste, or even changing the consumer behavior. So we have basically looked at these inefficiencies in the existing version of the linear value chain and picked them up for what we will discuss as the strategy framework and action plan. Bringing back you to this slide, and as we talked about, the next few slides will focus on how the circularity hotspots were assessed for two: sustainable feedstock production, the first hotspot, and the second hotspot, which is around valorizing residues, and I'll explain what that means as we go along. And as you would see, this is not just focused on bio-based industry, it's a cutting across for smart mobility as well as for lifestyle and services. In terms of creating circularity and bringing circular value chains to the existing linear value chains, ERM looked at three enabling factors. The first one here is creating circularity right at the design stage. This basically looks at how do you look at land use practices? What kind of crops would be best fitted for what kind of agriculture practices? For example, if you convert rubber plantation to new agriculture feedstock areas, it will have more circular impact, less land use pressure as compared to converting peatlands or rainforest. Similarly, how do you extend or rotate crops within the same land? How do you look at nutrient management? Nutrient management is something which is least talked about in context of EEC in Thailand. But if you look at some of the developing economies like Europe, which have already dominated in the space of circular economy and biomass, they faced huge challenges when it came to nutrient balance like potash and nitrogen supply for agricultural demand. The second is resource optimization. How do you look at planning your yield and balancing the land use practices accordingly. For example, what kind of ethanol production would have what kind of impact in context of waste, energy, and emissions. Looking at strategic use of what we call multi-purpose crops, and this is what means as valorizing residues, of how same crop can be reused, not just in terms of the main crop, but also the residue from the crop can be brought into the biorefineries. Similarly, how do you integrate the multi-use crops to your biorefineries by creating a circular mechanism? And then finally, recovery and reuse. How do you enable the infrastructure and supply chain to collect back the residues and connect the end of the life cycle to the input of the life cycle? Moving on to the first part, which is sustainable feedstock production. Sustainable feedstock production is a pretty big term. It essentially means energy crops that are grown on lands that do not compete for land use and do not have a negative impact on the land use practices. So that's essentially what is meant by sustainable feedstock production. Because this topic is very big, it is further divided into these 5 areas. The first 3, which is essentially improving land use practices, increasing biomass production, and managing emissions from these conversions, are focused around the land use practices. What we have done in context of these 3 areas is looking at how EEC and the existing policies can promote multi-use crop rotation and promoting the use of bio-waste residues for biorefinery expansion. Nutrient balance, as I said earlier, is another important element where Thailand and EEC can take early steps to ensure that there are no lack of nutrient balance to support the growing agricultural demands. And finally, sustaining water supplies. If you look at some of the global context, one of the things that our studies focused on capturing in a lot of details is that how have these topics impacted across the globe as other economies have moved towards bio-based economies. So these are some of the data-driven aspects, and you would see from the first chart here that depending on the type of land that you use for a type of crop production, there is a huge impact in terms of emissions. Similarly, depending on the type of crop that is under agriculture, there is a huge impact on the amount of water that it consumes, which also indirectly and directly links to the weather conditions of that area. Finally, the table below, which shows the red and the greens, shows you that for the top 2 crops or the top 2 fuel outputs of ethanol produced from corn and sugarcane, which definitely have a high fuel yield value, they also have a very high impact in terms of emissions, water, fertilizer, pesticide, and energy consumption. So it is very important to look at the land use practices vis-a-vis the crop yields and planning for the expansion of agricultural produce in context of the sustainable practices. This is crucial as Thailand expands into more biofuel production, and it will also be crucial towards the next topic that we'll discuss around valorizing residues. As we talked about the gaps, you would see here a summary of the gaps assessment for the sustainable feedstock, which is our first hotspot. So we see that in terms of policy and procedures, we are already ahead. There's definitely a strong policy framework in place to support the bio-based industries, particularly the plans that have come out by AEDP, promoting the VSPPs and SPPs, the feed-in tariff systems, and the decentralization of the bio-industries are very strong mechanisms to further promote bio-industries in EEC and Thailand. However, the infrastructure is still lacking. There is lack of infrastructure to collect and connect the biomass or the production to the biorefineries. Similarly, business strategies are there, but it is not replicated across industries. It's very much dominated by the national players. We see very less coming in from the private sector when it comes to bio-based industries. Partnerships are growing. Supply chain as infrastructure is challenged because most of the stakeholder conversations we had were all talking about increasing source. How do I get more feedstock, right? Technology innovation is again lacking, and in fact, it is slightly starting to pick up with initiatives from EECI, for example, with focus on sustainable aviation fuel, moving away to biofuel production from algae use, which is essentially a third and a fourth generation use, and now with this program also emphasizing on valorizing second generation biofuel production. With that, I would like to bring you to our next mentee question. We like to understand your feedback on what you understand or what you think are the gaps to promote bio-based industries in Thailand. Great, we are already getting some answers here. We would like to understand what are the key obstacles in your view for promoting sustainable feedstock production in Thailand. It's a multiple choice because of course challenges is not one, it's multiple. So please select as many options as you like. We would like to understand your viewpoint for promoting sustainable feedstock production. We'll give it a few seconds. I think we already have a few votes in, and mostly around policy support, infrastructure, problems of sourcing raw materials, definitely, which is a supply chain aspect, infrastructure, it's getting more votes, co-location of bioproducers to biorefineries. This is something which is definitely one of the aspects our stakeholders also talked about. It's interesting that a lot of votes have come, or significant amount of votes have come around policy support. So if you notice that in our gap assessment, we are providing it as green, which means that already there are a number of policies in place. However, the gap essentially is in understanding and articulating of these policies towards the public and private sector, more towards the private sector. So this you would see coming together in the action plan, that how the existing policies which are already there can be better articulated and better reached out to the private sector for leveraging. So it's not that the policies are not there or the incentives are not there, it's more how the private sector is not able to use some of these policies for expanding their bio-based business. Great, we actually have the highest vote in context of policy and infrastructure. So we'll talk more about this particular gap. In fact, this is a very big perceived gap in terms of policy support. While more policies are required, but the existing policies that are there in context of decentralization of biorefineries are potentially requiring more support in terms of awareness and capability building. With that, we will move to the next segment. Okay. In this question, we are wanting your opinion on understanding what are the key obstacles for valorizing residues. While we'll talk a little bit about valorizing in the next section, what do you think are the key obstacles for reusing of waste from the bio-based industries and diverting it back to biorefineries as a feedstock? The mentee codes are given on the screen above. We already have a few votes in here in terms of the current laws and regulation. Lack of business strategy, lack of international and local partnerships, current laws. So while we move on to talk about the valorizing residues, I would like you all to keep in mind the results from these two questions. When we talk about sustainable feedstock production, you saw that a lot of votes have come around policies and infrastructure. And we talked about valorizing residues, a lot of votes have come around policy and infrastructure. So as I said, in context of sustainable feedstock production, there is definitely existing policies, but the adoption rate is low. But infrastructure and supply chain is definitely a gap that has been confirmed by the stakeholder interactions in EEC. However, now as we move to valorizing residues, and allow me to explain a little bit about this topic, you will see that here the gaps exist more in terms of policies rather than the infrastructure, because this is a topic which is very new to EEC and to Thailand. So what does valorizing residues even mean? Valorizing residues essentially is a term coined for multi-purpose crops, which means that if I am looking at rice cultivation, I'm not just using rice as a consumer product, but I'm also looking at the rice straw as one of my feedstock options. If I'm looking at cassava for biofuel production, I'm also looking at the roots of cassava for an alternative feedstock production. So it essentially focuses on the same crops, but it uses its additional crop elements as an input to the biorefineries as an additional feedstock usage. This concept is called second generation biofuel production. First generation focuses on the primary crops, which is sugarcane, cassava, but the second generation moves away and reduces the pressure on the first generation and focuses on roots, straws, and the residues that are left from agriculture. What is very interesting for Thailand is that based on the data collected from almost 51 provinces in Thailand, there are some highlights given on this slide. For example, there is as much rice straw left which can produce crude oil equivalent of 3,000 kilotons per year, powering almost 800 megawatts. But it is unutilized. Similarly, there is as much cassava roots left which can power up to 152 megawatt, which is equivalent to 20% efficiency of a power plant for 350 days a year. However, this is left unused. So, this database, which is internal to Thailand and accessible to all, is a very difficult database to interpret, right? So when our analysts went into this database, we had to extract the data and analyze the data. But what we found is that Thailand has enough resources when it comes to second generation biofuel production. However, all of these resources are left unused. Now, on the other hand side, when you look at how valorizing residues is used in a global context, it is not just used for only biofuel production, but these residues are diverted into other industries. For example, clothing, cars, used as car material, the clothing material in cars, cosmetics, or even in pharmaceutical industries. So across the world, the bio-based residues are already used for second generation fuel production, and alternatively, they're also used for other industries. And hence, this particular hotspot is a very important and crucial for Thailand in context of the increasing biofuel demand, as well as the pressure on land use from the primary crops. In global context, this has been a growing challenge, but certain economies are moving very fast on adopting this particular circularity hotspot. The key is that because the same type of crops are in demand for the same type of outputs, it is creating a supply bubble. That means I would need more and more cassava or sugarcane for primary production of ethanol. However, I would go on cultivating more of cassava, thereby creating pressure on the land use and adopting unsustainable agricultural practices. If you look at some examples, very interesting examples around how residues have been used across the world. For example, Pinatex is a textile that is created from pineapple residues. Tomato fibers are being used for packaging. Shell-based residues are used in chitin production for cosmetics. So these are just some examples that in the next wave can also be utilized for Thailand in terms of leveraging that unused bio-based residues that is sitting untapped. And as I said, alternative biomass and valorizing residues is crucial for biowaste management as well. And this can be seen across the world with a lot of best case examples where husk, leaves, and even tree-based residues are being used for creating cellulosic ethanol. It also gives Thailand a number of opportunities for investment, particularly in renewable energy, organic fertilizers, research and development. Coming to the gaps, and this is where you will start seeing some correlation between feedstock and valorizing residues. Unlike the feedstock production, in context of valorizing residues, we are seeing that the policy is a big challenge. Currently, there are no policies in place which promotes using valorizing residues as a feedstock or an alternative feedstock option in biorefineries. The processes are there, primarily driven by local players like Metropole, who are already in process of valorizing their residues. Infrastructure, big gap. There are no infrastructures in place, and this is a big gap in terms of bringing more collection, more sorting, and more diversion of these waste residues into biorefineries. Business strategy is somehow developing because the national players in Thailand are already starting to look at the alternative use of residues. Partnerships are definitely lacking because not a lot of public-private partnerships are currently existing in the field of valorizing residues. Supply chain as infrastructure is also a gap. Technology innovation is somewhat starting, particularly as I said in context of sustainable aviation where algae is used. However, also in second generation feedstock, we can see some examples from the national players to use the current residues like cassava roots. However, there is a gap in culture as well in terms of looking at these bioresidues as alternative options for not just fuel production, but also for consumer goods. Okay, so we're back at this question. In fact, this question was supposed to come in after the gaps, but it happens. Technology sometimes does give us some twist. So now, as you've already looked at what is valorizing residues and how valorizing residues is slightly different from sustainable feedstock production, we welcome you to vote again on this question if you think that your responses might have changed. We'll just give it 30 seconds to see if the voting results now change on this question. Okay, so I think as we agreed that the policies and the infrastructure is a big gap when it comes to valorizing residues, and that has also come up pretty clear in the voting results. Taking you to the next section. Coming to the circularity promotion strategy. So as we showed you, the 4 pillars that create the circular economy framework for Thailand, we have leveraged the same to say what will be EECO's circularity investment promotion strategy. And this is focused on the 2 hotspots that we just looked at, valorizing bio-waste residues and sustainable bioproduction. The first is design for circularity. Here, we are focused on policy and incentives framework and creating additional tax rebates and incentives to reduce the dependency on first-generation biofuels. Rethinking of business models, where it is very much required for ECO to unlock the value sitting in residues and bio-waste, and creating industrial symbiosis and permit efficiencies to leverage the existing policies and divert it for fast growth. Collaborations, connected supply chains would be crucial for bringing in the cross-collaboration from where the produce is happening, where waste are generated, and then bringing it back to the refineries. And finally, Take enabling the supply and demand. How does a biorefinery get to know that there is available feedstock as cassava roots or rice straws that I can bring in for my fuel production? Create a technology platform using startups, technology partners that can help you connect the demand and supply side of bio-based industries. So based on those factors that we showed you, we already have some results here, but please feel free to start voting. What, in your opinion, needs to be prioritized for EECO's circularity investment promotion strategy for bio-based sector? First, as we discussed, is the focused policy and incentive framework, tax rebates, focusing on investment to unlock the second-generation feedstock productions, industrial symbiosis, connected supply chains, scaling up biorefineries, bio-based technology platform, and a digital circular economy forum. Which of these do you think would be most critical to enable circularity for EECO? Please give us your votes because this will form the basis of our action plans as well. Currently, there are very high votes for two of these, which is focused policy incentives. We completely agree and align to this. There's definitely a need for more policy and incentives for valorizing of residues and the technology platforms to support the demand-supply connection. We're also seeing good votes for tax rebates and incentives. We'll give it a few more seconds for you guys to vote. Also the team on Zoom. Connected supply chains, definitely. Still policy, incentives, tax rebate, and bio-based technology platform in the lead. And maybe a few more before we close out. Great. I think we are very aligned with our study results are very aligned with what you think. The focus policy and incentive framework is a must-have, along with tax rebates and incentives to promote second-generation biofuels, third generation, and even fourth generation, and bio-based technology platform. With that, let's move to the next segment. So let's come to the most important element, which is the action plan and the relevant organizations. We have divided our action plan into 4 buckets. The first one is technology support. What you will see here now is that we have prioritized these action plans over the next 3 phases. The first phase, which is up to 6 months, the next phase of 6 to 12 months, and the third phase, which will move up to a year or more. The first and foremost action plan is to launch feasibility study for understanding where agricultural residues are sitting, in how much quantity, and what is the potential. The numbers I gave you around rice straws and cassava roots is just an example. There is enough untapped potential sitting in Thailand around biomass residues across the country, which can be used by the biorefineries and for scale-up of fuel production. However, today, private sector, even public sector, or the investors do not know where to go and where to hunt for these alternative feedstock. So the first action plan is to create a very detailed guidance for these alternative feedstocks, understand the barriers, understand the seasonality, right? Which season, which crop type would be available, which kind of residue can I use, and create an international vendor ecosystem for the investors and players to understand and tap into the agricultural residues. The second is promoting for revisions in the current AEDP policy framework to incorporate and focus more on second and third generation biofuel production in Thailand. The ADP policies are really strong. They have created a tremendous growth and fuel into the biofuel production for Thailand. However, it needs now revisions to support and promote the second and third generation as well. What I mean, again, re-emphasizing, second generation means moving away from the primary crops, and third generation means moving to alternative sources like algae. Keep in mind that there are already existing incentives and plans, pilot programs going on in Thailand, for example, algae-based fuel production. So we need to create more focus on this through the AEDP policy revisions. Then would come the launching of industrial guidelines. Because the technology is a gap and the understanding of technology is a gap, it is very important for the industrial clusters to understand where and how and using what technology they can leverage these residues. The first phase or the three focus industries for these guidelines should be bioplastics, biochemicals, and consumer goods. Some of the examples in our studies provide very detailed examples of what kind of residues can actually be used, for example, bioplastics industries and consumer good industries. So leveraging the untapped potential for residues, how can you have more of these industries use alternative feedstock options? Create and invest pilot scale production in the EEC region, and it can be focused on the EECI, to launch multi-purpose crop use. While there are multiple pockets that are already existing for use of multi-purpose crops, EEC will become an enabler by creating a pilot program to launch how industries can valorize residues. Create a pilot and have it as a showcase for all industries, and it can be focused on the top residues, which is cassava roots, sugarcane, bagasse, and rice straws. Launch Thailand's performance report. This should allow Cannot hear. Okay.
ค่ะช่วงนี้ขออนุญาตแก้ไขระบบสักครู่เดียวนะคะตอนนี้เกิดเหตุขัดข้องสักเล็กน้อยนะคะต้องขออภัยผู้ที่มาร่วมประชุมสัมมนาในวันนี้ด้วยนะคะขอเวลาสักประมาณ5นาทีนะคะสำหรับการจัดปรับปรุงแก้ไขระบบสักเล็กน้อยค่ะ So we'll have a take a break of 5 minutes for
I'll restart that. Sure.
ต้องขออภัยกับการขัดข้องทางเทคนิคสักเล็กน้อยด้วยนะคะประมาณ5นาทีค่ะอีกสักครู่นะคะซึ่งเดี๋ยวหลังจากที่ระบบกลับมาcomplete เรียบร้อยแล้วค่ะทางคุณรตินะคะจะพูด recap ประมาณ5นาทีนะคะสำหรับเซสชันที่ได้กล่าวพรีเซนต์ไปเมื่อสักครู่นะคะแล้วเราก็จะไปกันต่อค่ะสำหรับหัวข้อที่กำลังพรีเซนต์อยู่นั่นเองนะคะสักครู่เดียวค่ะ หลังจากที่เราจบเซสชันนี้แล้วนะคะขออนุญาตเผ พื่อความต่อเนื่องของการสัมมนานะคะเราจะไปต่อในหัวข้อถัดไปเลยค่ะสำหรับแขกท่านผู้มีเกียรติที่อยู่บริเวณด้านในห้องบอลลูมสัมมนาแห่งนี้นะคะสำหรับท่านไหนที่ต้องการจะรับ Coffee Break ค่ะทุกท่านสามารถนำ Coffee Break กลับเข้ามาทานบริเวณด้านในห้องบอลลูมได้นะคะ
Taking a break now. Sure.
อีกสักครู่เดียวนะคะซึ่งสำหรับเซสชันของคุณรตินะคะที่มีการพรีเซนต์ในช่วงนี้ค่ะก็จะเป็นการนำเสนอภาพรวมการศึกษาและเสนอถึงกลยุทธ์และแผนการดำเนินงานเพื่อขับเคลื่อนการลงทุนในเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนสำหรับภาค Bio-based นั่นเองนะคะซึ่งทั้ง2หัวข้อนี้ล้วนแล้วแต่น่าสนใจเป็นอย่างยิ่งค่ะเมื่อสักครู่ก็ได้มีการบรรยายไปในหัวข้อที่ค่อนข้างจะน่าสนใจและถือว่าเป็นการตอบโจทย์ในยุคปัจจุบันได้ดีทีเดียวค่ะอีกสักครู่เดียวนะคะเราจะทำการพรีเซนต์อย่างต่อเนื่องค่ะหลังจากที่จบเซสชันของคุณรติแล้วค่ะจะมีอีก1หัวข้อที่น่าสนใจค่ะเป็นการนำเสนอกลยุทธ์และแผนการดำเนินงานเพื่อขับเคลื่อนการลงทุนในเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนสำหรับภาคการผลิตกันบ้างซึ่งเซสชันถัดไปค่ะสปีกเกอร์นั่นคือคุณยูเลียโดโบลูบาวาค่ะพาร์ทเนอร์จาก ERM นั่นเองอีกสักครู่เดียวค่ะสำหรับ Coffee Break สามารถนำเข้ามาทานบริเวณด้านในห้องสัมมนาของเราได้เลยนะคะ
2 slides. So not the action plan, even before that. I think I can start from the action plan, right?
Action plan okay นะคะ
Okay, so I'll restart from the action plan. Yeah.
Soค่ะขออนุญาตนะคะไปกันต่อค่ะสำหรับ Action Plan นะคะเมื่อสักครู่ที่มิสรติได้มีการพรีเซนต์ไปนะคะบางท่านอาจจะไม่ได้ยินเสียงอาจจะมีเหตุขัดข้องสักเล็กน้อยเพราะฉะนั้นเราจะเริ่มทำการพรีเซนต์สำหรับ Action Plan ค่ะถ้าพร้อมแล้วค่ะมิสรติ please
Thank you. Apologies for that little technical error. We'll restart from the most important aspect, which is the action plan and what action plans have been prioritized for EEC to promote bio-based industry. The first segment for the action plan is technology support. Here, the first action is to create a feasibility study for different agricultural residues focused on 2 industries, chemicals and consumer goods. This basically links to our point that there is a large amount of untapped bio-based resources in Thailand. However, the users, the consumers, the industries do not have a good idea of how to use these residues, be it for primary fuel production or diverting them for secondary or third generation fuel production. Hence, EEC will focus on creating a guidance for the agricultural residues for the industries identifying the quantums, the volumes, sources, key barriers, and also seasonality for these crop-based residues. EEC will also support on working towards a revision in AEDP to support additional policy framework and incentives to promote second and third generation fuel production in Thailand. Currently, AEDP has been instrumental in supporting the policy frameworks for the first generation fuel and increased biorefineries implementation. However, it needs to further move into a direction of providing incentives and tax rebates for second and third generation fuel production as well. The next action is focused on launching an industrial guidelines for helping industries understand the technology implications and the feedstock specifications for using residues for 3 focus industries: bioplastics, biochemicals, and consumer goods. This guideline would focus on how value-added services can be created by diverting these residues into industrial use. The next action plan is focused on a pilot-scale production in the EEC region for strategic use of multi-purpose crops, or what we call valorizing crop residues, focused on the top 3 residue types, which is cassava roots, sugarcane bagasse, and rice straws. The next one, also a very important one, would be to design and launch Thailand's Bioeconomy Performance Report. With the increasing amount of advancement around the bio-based industries, it is very important that a performance report can be published not just at the national level, but can be orchestrated at a global level in context of showing what are the goals and how Thailand is progressing against these goals for the bio-based industries. The second segment for the action plan is policy and regulatory enablement. Here, the first action plan is to define a policy framework for second generation biofuel production in Thailand, covering different kind of feedstocks, moving away from the primary crops, and focusing on ligno-cellulose feedstock to municipal and bio-waste options as well. Developing and harmonizing the collection process, or what we call the infrastructure and supply chain, to promote the use of residues, bio-waste, would be a focus of this action plan. Next will be to create a one-stop service, and this links to the gaps in understanding the policies that you saw in sustainable feedstock. So as we said earlier, not that policies don't exist. Policies exist, but there is a gap in adopting the policies. So the action plan here focuses on simplifying the policy regulation, making it easy to understand and interpret, and also creating a one-stop portal for accessing all permits, rebates, tax incentives for any new investor who wants to enter EEC or Thailand for bio-based industries. Introducing a tax incentive plan for promoting second and third generation biofuel, specifically for the aviation and automotive segment, would be the next action plan. The next category of the action plan focuses on skill development and awareness, which is a very crucial bucket for the overall segment. The first action here is to develop a national skill development program which will help in industries and supply chain players to understand how waste needs to be collected, from where, what kind of sorting practices and principles need to be adopted, and how this skill needs to be transferred to the SPPs, or the small power producers, and the VSPPs, or the very small power producers, which are currently very critical in the bio-based industries. This will also focus as a phase 1 campaign on designing and launching a series of campaigns for educating and imparting people to understand about valorizing residues, focused on promoting second and third generation fuel production. The phase 2 campaign of the skill development will focus on valorizing residues and diverting biomass to other industrial segments like consumer goods, biochemicals, and bioplastics. So the phase 1 we talked about focusing on how second generation fuel can be produced, thereby reducing the pressure on first generation fuels and first generation crops. And the phase 2 of this campaign would focus on how these residues can also be diverted to other industrial segments like biochemicals, consumer goods, and bioplastics. Next, under this bucket would be to design and launch a series of knowledge sharing sessions like this and more, where national and international players can come together, discuss about new technologies to help reduce the pressure on first generation crops, improvise land use practices, and valorizing residues. And finally, the fourth pillar of action plan is around digital enablement. Here, we are recommending to create Thailand's first bioeconomy commercial trading platform to boost the private players to enter the biofuel production in Thailand. Currently dominated by national players, the play from private sector and private investors is very limited. This bioeconomy commercial trading platform will connect private players, SPPs, and VSPPs to bio-based residues, small agricultural producers, and create commercial and viable models to extend the supply chain. This will further extend into creating what we call as the bioeconomy supply-demand digital platform. The digital platform will connect the supply and the demand side, the producer to the consumer. And this will also enable price sensitivities, price mechanism, bidding structures to come in place for getting alternative feedstocks for running and scaling up biorefineries. And lastly, the Thailand Digital Circular Economy platform will be a one-stop platform that enables policies and incentives to be linked to valorizing residues, sustainable crop production, having industrial guidelines in place for leveraging residues like in different industries of biochemicals and bioplastics, having recorded knowledge-based sessions, technical sessions, capability building sessions in place for new investors, small players, private sectors, and creating a repository for international best practices and case studies, global case studies, for understanding how bioresidues have been used in different industrial segments. So to summarize, our action plan for ECO is focused on 4 segments: technology support, policy and regulatory enablers, building the human capacity or building capability, developing skills and transferring skills, and finally, enabling the bioeconomy through a digital platform. And all the different logos that you see here on the slide will be the ecosystem of collaboration and partners that will help implement these action plans. With that, we come to a very important segment, and we would like you to help us rank your idea about these action plans. We talked about various support action plans to promote the bio-based industries in Thailand. Please use your Menti code to rate against these different options of which one do you feel would be the most important action plan to prioritize for the bio-based segment in Thailand. We'll give it a few minutes. I can see some responses are already coming in. One question, okay.
So the question is that who is the target user for biofuel? Industrial facility is cell-based truck or gasoline-based passenger car. And in the future, converting biomass to biogas and electricity may be more practical.
That's a great question coming up on the chat. The target user for biofuels, all the EEC sectors that we talked about, right from the food industry to the smart mobility, to digital, to service and lifestyle, would be the potential users of biofuels. Currently, the use of biofuels, and in fact even the production of biofuels, is very focused on the automotive sector with ethanol and fuel production. However, as you see, the potential of bio-based residues is unlimited. So in the future, this bio-based industries will extend to renewable options to all different segments, as mentioned here, plus more into the consumer industries, into bioplastics and biochemicals as well. It is important to note that the plastics and the chemicals industries are also moving towards leveraging bio-based feedstock. So the Shells and the Exxons of the world are looking at transforming their plastic conversions or the different waste into different kind of feedstocks. So it is important to note that bio-based residues will not just be in use for different kind of fuel production, but also for production of bioplastics and biochemicals and different kind of consumer goods. I hope that helps address the question. Okay, so as you would see here in terms of the ranking, we are still getting some votes in. We'll encourage all our audience to give us their opinion about which action plans are high in their mind. Give us a ranking. You can actually give a ranking for all the 5 options. The one that is leading here is definitely the industrial guideline. And our study and our analysis is completely aligned to it. Currently, there is abundance of bio-based residues in Thailand. However, there is a gap in understanding how to leverage these residues or divert these residues to different industries. So that will be a key action plan in terms of creating guidelines for helping use these residues. Study, of course, the study for different residues. Through our engagement, we have already created quite a good database on what kind of residues are available and what kind of international best practices are in use for diverting these residues into different kind of industries. However, a more formal study, which can be done in Thai language and can be extended to the public and private sectors, would be definitely beneficial. The ADP policy framework, that definitely stands pretty high on the agenda. And then finally, the pilot scale production project in EECI and the bioeconomy performance report. I'm surprised that it has got the lowest priority, but definitely something that will become important as we move along, because it is very important to monitor and track where we are heading, and that is the only possible through performance reporting. Great, thank you for the responses on this. The next one, we would like your responses to come on the policy and the regulatory enablers from high to low. I think we will come back to this question after the policy framework. So let's go back to our slides. Okay. So let's talk about a few examples of why we are talking about the circularity hotspots and how the world across has used some of these bio-based industries, valorizing residues for economic development. So just to give you a very high-level view, the direct job creation that happened in US or is happening right now as we speak from the bio-based segment or the biofuel industry in US has resulted in about more than 190,000 new jobs to be created in 2022. That just gives you an idea about the economic enablement that will happen with the bio-based segment by creating new jobs and bringing more revenue into the country. Interestingly also, the total economic outputs that will contribute to the GDP, if we look at US as a case study, their expected revenue contribution from bio-based industries is expected to rise to $37 billion in the next 5 years. And the same level of economic outputs and benefits can be expected for Thailand as well. Another very interesting example for how EU has created, EU as in European Union, has launched what is called the Bio-Based Industrial Consortium. And this consortium has launched a digital platform for all the bio-based industries in the economic region. This is an available and publicly available case study. This platform, as we were talking about, connects the supply and the demand side of the value chain by bringing the producers close to the manufacturers. And a similar enablement is what we are proposing as an action plan for EECO. Coming to the last segment of our presentation for the first segment here, which was bio-based, is the policy roadmap. While there are many policies in place, very effective policies in place, it is very important that we look at what we call the Thailand Bioeconomy policy, which should integrate all aspects of circularity and all aspects across the value chain. There are 3 overarching components of this policy, or the new policy that we are proposing. The first is focused around promoting biomass availability. Biomass exists, but it doesn't come to the manufacturers at the right time. So enhancing the biomass availability by bridging the gap between supply, demand, by connecting the producer to the manufacturers would be the first component of this new policy. The second component is focused on the sustainable production, which will focus on incorporating circular principles and enabling regenerative resources. This will help enable creating sustainable production practices and reducing the pressure on the existing land use resources. Very crucial for scale-up and growth. The third component will focus on diversifying industrial use, which is what Valorizing Residues focus on. So rather than focusing on the primary crops, focus on bringing new industrial use, new crops, and the residues of the crops into use for industrial products, consumer goods, bioplastics, and many more. So this is an overarching view of the new bioeconomy policy roadmap that we are proposing to come in play to promote and support the bio-based industries and promote circularity across the country. And finally, coming back to the gaps or the pillars that we outlined for the success enablement, you would see here that we have summarized what would be required for each of the pillars to be successful. When it comes to policy, it is very important to define a policy framework that supports the new generation biofuels. A central agency which will overlook implementation of circularity across the country and in EEC. New tax rebates and progressive incentives to promote bio-based industries and reduce dependency on primary fuels. Partnerships and collaborations would be a must-have. Pilot scale productions for new technology, second and third generation fuel productions. Scaling up of existing biorefineries by bringing better infrastructure and supply chains together. One of the key challenges we talked about was how co-location of biorefineries to agricultural produce would be must-have. Technology innovation will also be key. As new sources of feedstock come into play, industries will need more support on technology innovation and understanding where the field output or the fuel outputs will be maximized using what kind of fuel, what kind of feedstock residues. And finally, creating the supply chain, connecting the supply chain right from the agricultural producer, which is the farmers, all the way to the industries. With that, I would like to conclude the first segment on bio-based industries and valorizing residues. We can now take a small break and move to our next speaker for the next segment.
และสำหรับช่วงนี้นะคะจะเป็นเซสชันของ Q&A ค่ะ so right now is this the Q&A session yes และสำหรับช่วงนี้นะคะสำหรับท่านไหนที่มีคำถามค่ะสามารถพิมพ์คำถามเข้ามาที่บริเวณแชทบ็อกซ์ของเราได้เลยนะคะหรือสำหรับท่านที่อยู่บริเวณด้านในห้องสัมมนาแห่งนี้ค่ะถ้ามีคำถามสงสัยค่ะเรียนเชิญได้เลยค่ะมีไหมเอ่ย
This question is come in Thai, so Nop, would you like to translate and maybe the answer as well?
เดี๋ยวเราขออนุญาตเช็คนะคะสำหรับในช่องของแชทบ็อกซ์สักครู่นะคะว่ามีคำถามสงสัยไหมเอ่ยสักครู่นะคะ
Oh, good.
ได้เลยค่ะ
So I think we have addressed some of the questions in the chat box already. Let's now move to our next speaker. Thank you very much.
ขอบคุณค่ะขอบคุณคุณรัติพัฒนาชยาค่ะ Principal Consultant from ERM Thank you very much for the amazing presentation แล้วก็ขออนุญาตย้ำอีกหนึ่งครั้งนะคะระหว่างการบรรยายค่ะหากท่านใดมีคำถามค่ะต้องการสอบถามท่านวิทยากรค่ะสามารถพิมพ์คำถามหรือความคิดเห็นลงมาในกล่องสนทนาแชทบ็อกซ์ได้เลยค่ะซึ่งเราก็จะรวบรวมเพื่อสอบถามจากวิทยากรให้ในช่วงท้ายหลังจากการจบการบรรยายในแต่ละช่วงค่ะสำหรับแขกท่านผู้มีเกียรติที่อยู่บริเวณด้านในห้องบอลลูมแห่งนี้นะคะถ้ามีคำถามสงสัยค่ะสามารถติดต่อสอบถามได้ในช่วง Q&A ท้ายเซสชันการบรรยายนั่นเองค่ะแล้วก็สำหรับเซสชันถัดไปเลยนะคะเราจะดำเนินการต่อเพื่อความต่อเนื่องค่ะช่วงถัดไปนี้ค่ะจะเป็นหัวข้อของการนำเสนอกลยุทธ์และแผนการดำเนินงานเพื่อขับเคลื่อนการลงทุนในเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนสำหรับภาคการผลิตค่ะเซสชันนี้ค่ะนำเสนอโดยคุณยูเลียโดโบรลูบาวาค่ะพาร์ทเนอร์จาก ERM นั่นเองค่ะถ้าทุกท่านพร้อมแล้วนะคะเรียนเชิญพบกับหัวข้อถัดไปได้เลยค่ะ
ขอบคุณมากค่ะ Thank you very much. Good morning. Very nice to see you all today, online or here in present, and happy to be actually for the first time after the start of the pandemics in this kind of hybrid event. Hopefully we will have more face-to-face going forward. So now we're moving on to the next very important sector for the Thailand 4.0 strategy as well as for the Eastern Economic Corridor area, which is the manufacturing sector. All right. So first of all, what does manufacturing sector cover? For our study, we were focusing only on the four so-called high-tech industries that are relevant for EEC area, which are next generation automotive sector, digital, robotics, as well as aviation and related services. So similarly to the previous sector, we first of all looked into the traditional linear value chain, as we did also for the bio-based sector and other sectors for our study. And we tried to identify what could be the typical issues related to our sector here and where circularity hotspots could be integrated. It's quite a busy slide, but I would suggest that we focus first of all at the bottom line, which is the key summary of what the typical issues are in our manufacturing sector. So if we look first of all upstream, the way how our manufacturing products are designed and where the raw materials are sourced from and how manufacturing processes are looked like, you can see that there are a lot of environmental resources and energy related issues to how this is all produced, and not just in Thailand, but globally as well. In fact, for the high-tech technologies, we need to use a lot of rare earth and other minerals and materials that are quite critical, but at the same time, their mining takes a lot of energy and resources. So that's something that needs to be taken into account in our circularity program to make sure how we actually can reuse those minerals and materials from already existing products rather than mining them from the scratch. Secondly, manufacturing processes also could be improved. And again, electric vehicles, for example, definitely is a great way how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through their use. However, if you look into manufacturing of the components and in the first place, batteries for electric vehicles, this is also a very energy-consuming process, which needs to be improved going forward to reduce the value chain emissions of electric vehicles. Downstream, if we look into, for example, distribution, consumer use, and especially end of life of our products from the manufacturing sector, the most critical element is actually how we can, again, loop in traditional linear processes and start reusing and recycling more materials from those products, and as well as extending the life of those products to make them be used longer. So these are the most critical elements of the manufacturing sector that we identified. And now moving on to the hotspots and the slide that Rati has presented before. So you remember the 7 hotspot areas. And as Rati has mentioned, they are not necessarily directly connected, one hotspot area to one sector, but we have identified the key focus areas that may be relevant for across different industries. So with respect to the manufacturing sector, we looked in particularly into 2 key circularity hotspots. The first one is battery management. And as you can see from the slide, it is very specific to electric vehicles or mobility sector. However, addressing battery management circularity hotspot, you can potentially also expand it to some other manufacturing industries, even beyond the e-mobility. Secondly, end of life and material recovery. This is another hotspot area. And as you can see here, that would be relevant for all high-tech digital technologies, such as also aviation, logistics, intelligent electronics, as well as automation and robotics. So those 2 we'll look into more detail during this session. Lastly, looking into the circularity framework and how the processes could be improved. Once again, the 3 areas that we will be discussing today during this session, and also in line with what we have just discussed for the bio-based sector. First of all, circular value chain. What does it mean in terms of our manufacturing sector and circularity hotspots identified? Well, first of all is design, how our products are designed from the beginning so that you don't use that much resources and materials anymore for their production, and also how you can integrate renewable energy technologies into the production processes. The second element is recovery and reuse. This is pretty much about how we can reverse sustainable supply chain and use more resources from already existing products instead of creating components from the scratch. And also how to establish market for second-hand parts. Lastly, product life extension. This is a very important element for this circularity hotspots, and how we can actually extend the life, how we can support maintenance and for the existing products and services, and also how we can support the local market in Thailand for repair, resale, and remanufacturing for parts and components. All right, with that, let's move on to our first hotspot and explore it in more detail. And we will be talking about battery management. All right. Well, first of all, we should mention that globally and in Thailand as well, electric vehicles market is expanding. Already today, electric vehicles represent about 1% of the total sales and in the market, which is still low if we compare it, for example, with European countries or Japan, China, and other markets. However, the intention is there, and Thailand has ambitious plans to expand the share of electric vehicles to 30% by 2030. This is definitely a great incentive for the industry and for investors to look into this specific sector. However, there are certain challenges, as we have discussed, related to making this sector low carbon and circular. And the three areas that would need attention going forward to promote electric vehicles, and more specifically battery management, are: the first one is the charging accessibility and use of renewable sources of energy for charging. And we looked here into both Thailand case studies and international case studies, and this is definitely one of the important areas for the EV sector globally as well. So definitely how to make the charging stations more accessible, how to strategically plan the network of charging stations, how to manage between supply and demand, and especially costs for charging, and also how to potentially differentiate between charging costs and times during the day. Obviously, an important element here would be also providing access to renewable energy sources so that we can really differentiate and make electric vehicles low carbon. Second area of attention for the battery management is battery technology and cost. So how we can actually make batteries more affordable. Because as of now, one of the main issues with the use of batteries in electric vehicles is their cost. And another important piece here would be how we actually improve the battery life, and also can reuse components of the battery, minerals from it going forward for producing new batteries or other products. And the last important element of the battery management is how we make the batteries themselves low carbon and safe for use. And one of the important points we would need to mention here is that Thailand is already producing some types of batteries. However, if we look into specifically lithium-ion batteries that are key for electric vehicles, or even modern types of batteries, such as, for example, solid-state lithium-ion or zinc-air technologies, they still need to be localized in Thailand, which is not the case yet. However, there are some initial programs, but this definitely needs to be scaled up so that we can meet the growing demand for batteries for EVs. One of the hurdles here is that in Thailand, we don't have that much of the rare earth minerals, such as lithium, for example, that would be needed for these types of batteries. But this is something that we can discuss, of course, and maybe make potential partnerships with other countries like Indonesia, where these minerals would be easier to access. And this is one of our recommendations that we will look into going forward. Moving on. As I mentioned, during this study, we looked into international cases, what is going on in other parts of the world. And for electric vehicles market, definitely European Union would be one of the great examples where there is a lot of support from the government, both at the national level, but also at the local levels to promote EVs. And interestingly, if you look into the flower chart at the bottom of this slide, there are three key areas of attention for EV promotion that were developed by the World Economic Forum. And you will see that it's pretty much the same as we have presented for the EEC attention. And the most important part is that there is a lot of focus on collaboration and partnerships. For battery management and EV sector, you cannot do it alone, just with transportation sector. For example, it's definitely a big partnership between transportation, power sector, as well as the battery production industry. So that would be the main important point for this sector. In case of the European Union, there is a very interesting initiative that has been established, which is called Battery 2030 Plus. It's an incentive to really localize and modernize the battery industry in the European Union, which is promoted by the European Commission in collaboration with academic, research institutions, technology providers, and many, many other stakeholders, as you can see on this slide. It's a large initiative worth hundreds of millions of euro to basically support the localization of battery production in the European Union. However, this is a very interesting initiative that could be potentially replicated in Thailand as well, creating a hub for battery production here to support electric vehicles, or collaboration with European Union that could also support through their initiatives and fundings, similar incentives here in Thailand, and also to support production of certain components for European market. Moving on to the next slide. We can see some of the opportunities that exist for the battery management sector in Thailand. Well, starting from the battery electric vehicles production, as I mentioned previously, there is a big ambition of the Thailand government to promote 30% of the total Thai automotive production being electric vehicles by 2030. And there are already quite a few incentives in place for investors in this sector, including some tax incentives, manufacturing rebates, import duties. However, as we mentioned as well, the share currently of electric vehicles is relatively low as compared to the ambitious target. So definitely there is a room for investments in this space and to creating localized value chains and circular value chains. The second opportunity area is the manufacturing of parts and equipment for electric vehicles. As we know, there are quite a few electric vehicle types already being offered on the market, but only 2 of them in Thailand are actually being completely developed here in Thailand. So there is big room to develop more parts and equipment and components, including batteries, here in the country and in the EEC area in particular, so that more cars could be manufactured here. That could also help address all kind of import duties and other taxes related to import of components from abroad. Third area is the charging station operators. So we mentioned that to solve the EV promotion issue, we need to focus not only on the EV vehicles and batteries themselves, but also on the supply of charging infrastructure and making it more accessible to electric vehicles users. So here, it's very important to look into potential opportunities to collaborate with large oil and gas companies as well as with other players and even startup companies to develop this charging station network in the EEC area. And as you can see here on the slide, there are already quite a few incentives in place in Thailand that support development of charging stations, including corporate income tax, lower cost due to investment subsidy from Ministry of Energy and Electric Vehicle Association of Thailand, temporary lower electricity prices, tax holidays, and so on. Another important initiative that has been established in Thailand is the EV charging consortium that also helps develop demand for electric vehicle charging. Lastly, production of EV batteries, that's another important area for investments in Thailand. That could be a great and interesting circularity hotspot for this area. And as we mentioned before, currently the majority of batteries that are being produced in Thailand are more for hybrid vehicles. However, it would be important to develop more market for batteries for battery electric vehicles and develop new types of batteries such as solid-state lithium-ion technologies, for example. So a lot of focus is on innovation, research and development and capacities, as well as seeing how we can do the sourcing of minerals locally, for example, through recycling of those minerals from existing components and batteries. Moving on, similar to bio-based sector, we have conducted a gap assessment looking into what is already being done in Thailand and what could be potential opportunity areas to support battery management in the country. Firstly, starting with policies and regulations, we have seen already an ambitious target to promote electric vehicles. We also see quite a lot of policies and incentives around the uptake of electric vehicles as well as for development of charging infrastructure. However, there are certain gaps between the policies and what is actually happening on the ground. So definitely the pace of the development of the infrastructure and EV sector as such is not yet to meet the ambitious targets. So that's something that we may want to look into in more detail. And especially policies around extending life of the batteries and also policies around how we can potentially reuse the materials from the batteries and other components of electric vehicles. Second important point is the infrastructure. Again, there is a very strong infrastructure base in place to promote usage of electric vehicles in the country. However, the main concerns at the moment would be around how we can expand this infrastructure to really meet the fast-growing demand for electric vehicles across all different sectors. And especially for EEC area, where electric vehicles will be playing a very important role for all industries, be it for the industries themselves or for employees who work at these industries. So definitely we would need to pay a bit more attention into that. On the positive side, if we look into business strategy, there is definitely a lot of focus on how we can promote electric vehicles use in the country, as well as how we can create development of EV components here locally. In fact, Thailand already is a tier 2-3 producer of many components for electric vehicles for global brands, for global companies, but it will be really interesting to see how we can transform Thai market, especially in the EEC zone, to become tier 1 supplier of those components. Partnerships, we have seen already great examples in the EV sector, in particular in Thailand, with the EV Charging Consortium and Electric Vehicle Association of Thailand. So definitely that's where Thailand is already performing quite strongly. And again, as we mentioned, this is the sector that where you cannot go by without those strong partnerships between different players. As for the supply chain, again, we mentioned that there is a lack of localized EV production and especially the batteries production. So that's an area where we can develop more in Thailand. And technology and innovation would be one of the key elements to that. And lastly, social culture. It's very interesting that EVs in principle is something that needs to be promoted a bit more in Thailand because still the consumers' demands are more towards traditional cars. However, going forward, we need to create more acceptance and preference towards electric vehicles, including through financial incentives and creating better infrastructure for EVs, including through charging. And here we come to the first Mentee poll for this sector. And very similarly to the bio-based sector, the first question would be about what are, in your opinion, the main obstacles for the battery management promotion in Thailand. And you can select up to 3 different options. Let's give a few moments for everyone. All right, we can see answers coming in, and actually quite diverse. All right, let's see. So far, interestingly, the majority says it's a matter of EV promotion policies and battery promotion policies. However, most of other barriers have been mentioned by the respondees as well. Let's give maybe another minute for those who are joining us online to vote as well. Right. Well, thank you very much. You can still continue with your voting going forward. But I think the main output of this main session is that generally all those barriers matter. Maybe lack of localized EV production was not considered as such a big issue, whereas all other barriers have been confirmed. All right, let's move on to the next part. Thank you very much. And here is what we consider as the main focus areas for promotion of circularity for the battery management hotspot area. This is what we call the log frame, a logical framework for the circularity promotion. And as always with this kind of frameworks, my suggestion would be to look bottom up. So look first at the bottom of the slide, what we actually would like to achieve as desired outcomes. And then everything on top would be activities that are leading towards this desired outcome. So in the first place, if we talk about design for circularity, one of the key elements of our circularity promotion framework, what we would like to see more in Thailand is the enhanced policies and incentives aimed at increasing EV adoption. And this is very much in line with what you have been voting for during your Menti session. The second element to that would be enhanced uptake and usage of established charging infrastructure with planned growth across non-metros locations. And let's see, for the actual actions to achieve those desired outcomes, what we suggest is the overall redesign of the EV charging infrastructure in EEC area in a way that is compatible to global design specifications. It really meets the users' needs, and also it has flexible charging requirements and can also adapt the costing to different times of the day, for example, and it also can allow for fast charging and enhanced accessibility. And this is where, again, the partnerships with key players on the market could play an important role. The next element, rethink business model. So let's see, the desired outcomes would be to create an affordable new age fast charging infrastructure. So in a way, you also reduce the, extend the battery lifetime and also improve the accessibility of the charging for EV. And this would also mean expanded partnerships in EV and battery manufacturing space to include players in Tier 1 manufacturing. And also to look into end-of-life battery management and battery recycling. And to do so, the main activities would be to make simpler demand chargers to enable adoption of new age fast charging infrastructure, and to extend value chain services, business partners, to include also battery manufacturers and e-waste and technology players. And in the next hotspot, when we will be talking about material recovery and life extension, we will look into some examples of these partnerships from other countries. The third area is to promote collaborations. And again, the desired outcomes would be around established capacity networks for supply chain partners in EV. And here we'll talk about from the production of components up till the recycling of e-waste from the EVs. And extended infrastructure for EV battery management. And to do so, the main activity would be to develop additional and targeting user outreach programs to promote charging infrastructure on the one hand, and on the other hand, to promote e-waste management from the EVs. The last area would be technical enablement for circularity, and here the desired outcomes would be around established innovation hub for EV players, focusing on new age technologies for batteries in the first place, but also for electric vehicles, as well as recycling technologies, as we said. and also established integrated drive systems, one-stop charging stations aligned with the international standards like ISO 15118. And to do so, the main activity areas would be implement policy interventions for new age disruptive technologies, support research and development, similar to the battery 2030 plus program that we saw in the European Union, maybe in collaboration with the European Union and other international partners, and the rise of integrated drive systems that will require new investments. And I would like to pause here for another Menti session, just to see what do you think about the key strategic priorities that would be needed for the promotion of circularity investments in the battery management segment. So if we can switch to the Menti again, please. Thank you very much. And we can see already some of the answers in the system. So the question was, which of the suggested focus areas for the circularity promotion strategy for the battery management would be, in your opinion, important? And the majority, as you can see here, voted for the extend value chain services and business partnerships in this area, as well as implementation of policy interventions for new age disruptive technologies and R&D support. However, all other areas have been also noted as important ones, maybe with the exception of new investments into integrated drive systems, which was given less priority. Thank you very much, and we move on. All right. And now we're moving to the most important part of the battery management sector discussion. What would be the action plan, looking back at the circular economy promotion strategy? So as for the bio-based sector, we have also divided the key actions into phases 1 to 3, depending on how short-term they are in terms of urgency and also implementation opportunities. If we talk about technological support, what we would like to have in Thailand, an EEC zone, is the established Thailand battery management value chain from the very beginning of production of batteries till the very end of batteries, recycling, refurbishment, and generally e-waste management. We feel that that would be more phase 2, phase 3 action, just because there has to be a lot of preliminary work that needs to go into there, including incentives, creating partnerships. But we hope that towards phase 3, that would be achievable. To get there, as I mentioned, it would be very important to introduce enabling policies and regulations. Amongst those, the most important ones would be related to EV batteries support for production and for refurbishment, and more generally for e-waste management. On the other side, for the charging stations, it would be also important to support their future expansion in the EEC area. All right. Another important area of action would be to manage between supply and demand for the charging stations in particular, but more generally for electric vehicles market expansion. And here it would be very interesting to look into incentives for oil and gas and other startup players, so we can really manage the current initiatives going forward so they better meet the fast-growing demand for EV charging. Looking into human capacity, Thailand in general has already a very good base and a lot of good academic and research foundation for the EV sector and batteries in particular. But it would be really good to look into design and launch a series of awareness campaigns for broader acceptance of electric vehicles in the market, especially if we want to reach out the ambitious target of 30% by 2030. And another important element to that would be the enabling understanding of how we can, through electric vehicles, also improve the low carbon economy in Thailand, achieve net zero targets, as well as how we can make the electric vehicle sector more circular, including through the management of e-waste and batteries at the end of their life. The next step would be to develop additional and targeting user outreach program to promote charging infrastructure for long-distance commute and connect this initiative with overall EV promotion in Thailand. Another important area of action for EECO would be around digital solutions. And for this sector in particular, would be really important to launch Thailand's integrated battery management platform. So there is an access for users to opportunities where they can find batteries or where they can exchange batteries, which is already existing in the European Union as the first initiatives, as well as more guidance, easily accessible guidance on the charging opportunities, fast charging, and so on and so on. The last but not the least, if we talk about stakeholder involvement and awareness, it would be really important to develop new and strategic charging station placement plans and reposition them for long-distance commute and no-metro connectivity, especially in the EEC zone where electric vehicles probably will be promoted even at a faster rate than overall in the country. And in terms of research and development collaboration, it would be also important to promote next generation battery technology and connect the same to improved electric vehicles uptake in the country and in the EEC market. And here we can partner with new technology providers and as well as with other countries, as we mentioned before, for the supply of important materials and products for the batteries manufacturing here in Thailand. All right, then I suggest we move on to the last Menti session in this hotspot. Thank you very much. And the question was about suggestions on the action plan. Thank you very much. And we were tasked to rank the suggested actions for battery management based on your perceived priority from high to low. So let's see the results. The first place is improve incentives based on demand supply. So really managing demand and supply, and especially from the policy and incentive side. The second popular answer was establishment of battery management value chain in the EEC area, providing technological support for batteries refurbishment and e-waste management. The third most popular answer was review policy related to charging stations. The fourth, awareness campaigns, followed by user outreach programs and integrated battery management platforms, which is, by the way, quite in line with the prioritization of actions as it was in our action plan. So what received less votes actually is more like a longer-term solution, though important, whereas those that are on top of this pyramid are really critical ones. Thank you very much. And with this, we just have one closing slide for the battery management hotspot before we move on to the next one. But before then, actually, one case study from the World Economic Forum that developed a study on the global promotion of battery management that they did together with the Global Battery Alliance. And you will see that on this slide that effective battery management, making it circular and low carbon, actually can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, helping us achieve the Paris Agreement target. Secondly, it can create a lot of new additional jobs, and at the same time creating additional co-benefits, like, for example, reduced costs related to battery use and EV costs in general, and especially in the emerging economies like Thailand. However, to be able to achieve those sustainability benefits, quite critical would be those 4 areas mentioned on this slide, which is very much in line with our recommendations for the EEC, which are policy and regulatory incentives and framework, technical and logistical support, digital platform and solutions, as well as new business models and value chains. But the most important and critical element, as you can see here, is also around policies and regulations that need to be fixed in the first place to enable the next steps. And this slide is just looking a little bit more into details of the current European Union promotion scheme for the batteries management, led by the European Commission, but in close collaboration with the research and development organizations, with technology providers and electric vehicles manufacturers. And what is interesting, this partnership on batteries is not only to support the local production, but also to provide finance for international companies, including, for example, in Thailand, that could also apply for the support through the Innovation Fund to develop those supply chains for the batteries. All right, and this is the last slide that I promised. So again, similarly to the bio-based sector, we have identified the main focus areas, main success factors, what is needed for the battery management in the EEC area for us to move forward with the investments in this space. So on the policy side, we have mentioned that that's quite critical, both for the charging stations, but also for the e-waste management and extending battery lifetime and battery refurbishment. For partnerships, that's a very important sector where we need participation of the power, transport, as well as the battery manufacturing sectors altogether. And definitely collaboration between government, R&D, academic, industrial, and other partners, as we saw on example from the European Union. From the process side, it would be important to further provide financial incentives, making charging possible using renewable energy sources and making battery design and the whole life cycle more circular. On the business strategy side, it would be important to build own localized supply chains for batteries and EVs more generally in Thailand, an EEC zone ideally. And that would be an important growth hub for the EV sector, for the country as a whole, and potentially also for the region, knowing that how fast EV market is growing around ASEAN. In terms of infrastructure, the 2 important areas would be, of course, the charging stations that we mentioned already, but also establishing vehicle dismantling facility, as well as the facilities for e-waste management and refurbishing facilities for used batteries. On the social culture side, nothing critical. It's just a continuation of already ongoing awareness campaigns and programs to genuinely support the acceptance of electric vehicles. On the technology innovation, definitely integrated battery management platform and development of next generation batteries, as we mentioned. And supply chain would be pretty much similar to business strategy, localized production, localized end-of-life processes to make the processes generally circular as compared to traditional linear ones. And in particular for EECO, because most of those recommendations that we have developed are more generally for the different stakeholders in Thailand, but specifically for ECO, where you could play a role. Well, first of all, of course, is to support the battery advancement in the EEC area. And this could be done through localized manufacturing, of course, and supporting R&D for making this localized manufacturing possible. The second area is value chain integration, and also developing more localized e-waste management opportunities, the local facilitation centers, local dismantling centers, and facilitation for the e-waste overall management and platforms around this as well. And the last point is about enhanced connectivity, really playing as the intermediary role to connect different partners together that are relevant for the EV sector and the battery management hotspot in particular, including providing guidelines, awareness campaigns, standardization, in helping in also promoting information around the initiatives that are being taken place. I'll pause here for any questions that may be ready from the floor before we move on to the next hotspot. As I don't see any questions, I suggest I move on to the next hotspot in the sake of time. And if you still have any questions specific to the battery management, we can come back to this at the end of the session. Thank you very much. And we are moving on to another exciting hotspot area, which is called end of life and material recovery. Great. So when we were talking about battery management, in fact, we touched upon this a little bit, specifically to batteries for electric vehicles. On this slide, you can see, in principle, there are three options what you could do with batteries and any other components of the electronic and high-tech industries. The first, the simple one, but the most high emission one as well, is just disposal. It could go to landfill and probably not managed in the right manner, creating additional environmental issues. The other two options would be much better from the environmental as well as from the circularity standpoints. First is refurbishment or reuse, which means that the spent batteries can be used for the second time, extending their lifetime this way. And the third option is the recycling. So you really extract important materials, for example, nickel or cobalt from those batteries to be used in other production processes. And this can be applicable not just for the batteries, but all other components of our high-tech industries that are relevant for EEC, be it robotics, be it digital, data centers, servers, for example, if we talk about them, or if we talk about aviation and logistics. So an important consideration here would be to look into how we can, instead of just disposing those materials at the end of their life and products, to reuse them and bring back into our manufacturing processes. And a very interesting example that I promised to show you during the previous session is from Japan, where actually there has been a policy on mandatory recycling of used batteries already since a decade at least. And the government is working very closely both with manufacturers of batteries and products that batteries use, as well as with the recyclers, as well as, of course, the EV manufacturers, and making it in a way that the costs of the recycling do not pass on to the consumers, making this process commercially attractive for all the players in this cycle. But it wouldn't be possible, of course, without those supporting policies from the government and the partnerships and the frameworks that they have established within the country to make this circular loop happen. As we can see globally, the idea of extending of lifetimes of materials and products, as well as this end-of-life processes like refurbishing or recycling, is globally a very important and difficult topic. And in other countries, not only in Japan, but like the European Union, US, China, and of course ASEAN countries are increasingly looking into this hotspot. And lastly, in doing this, we can address many different sustainability concerns. For example, of course, reducing the unnecessary use of resources, materials, bringing all those elements back in our production system instead of just disposing them and producing something from scratch. All right, so speaking about EEC in particular, what could be the opportunities for investment in the end of life and recycling for the high-tech industries? Well, first of all, if we talk about the 4 manufacturing industries under this sector, you remember that one of them was aviation and logistics, which is very, very important for the EEC area in particular, if we want to promote EEC as the regional APAC hub. So obviously, we need to look into what would be opportunity areas for aviation and logistics in more detail. And we know that currently, Singapore plays an important hub for this area, but we definitely would like to see EEC playing a more important role. And opportunities could be, for example, in investing into maintenance of aircraft and providing local services for this. And for this, obviously, it would be very important to create, again, collaborations with different partners that exist on the market or creating even new structures. Interestingly, this could be a potential area also for international collaboration because obviously if we talk about aviation, we are talking about global players here. The second opportunity area is about creating Utapao Airport Industry Zone, focusing on maintenance, repair and overhaul, or what we call shortly MRO. And again, here in Thailand, there are already a lot of incentives around promotion of MRO, and this is definitely a very interesting opportunity area to invest, and this way also to promote circularity in the country and EEC, using Utapao as the hub for that. And lastly, end-of-life technology development, focusing here on, again, EV battery, as we mentioned in the previous hotspot, but also on other different components and materials across our high-tech industries. All right, so similarly for this hotspot, we have done a gap analysis to look into what is already being done in Thailand and EEC. And this is a quite innovative area, and definitely there are certain things that have been done already, like for example for the infrastructure, we can see that there is a stable and evolving infrastructure to support MRO industry in the EEC area in particular, with the new incentives having been announced and general ambition to create a strong hub here in the region for MRO. But the same infrastructure can be extended to, for example, e-mobility sector, and creating MRO support for electric vehicles, not just for aircraft. So if we look into policies and processes, currently there is lack of comprehensive incentives and regulatory framework to support extension of the end of life for electric mobility or for airlines to promote material recovery in the value chain. So similarly to the initiative that was done by Japan, for example, quite some time ago, it would be very, very important for Thai government to support similar partnership schemes and incentives to actually promote recovery instead of disposal of the materials. And there is a very important need to strengthen the business models, making this recovery commercially attractive for the players who are part of this value chain. For the business strategy, there are already activities in place in Thailand to support MRO industries. And there are already tier 2 and 3 suppliers here in Thailand. But it would be very interesting, similarly to the battery management, to shift from just tier 2 and 3 to tier 1 production of components needed for the refurbishment and repair. And for that, again, we need to create partnerships here. We need to create necessary infrastructure skills as well as potential ecosystem for making those parts available on the market instead of using new ones. We spoke about partnerships, we spoke about supply chain, technology innovation would be very critical for this circularity hotspot. Again, because we talk about innovative industries by themselves, we talk about innovative processes where we really need to think how we can create those circular value chains and how we can manage e-waste, which is by itself quite an innovative area. So definitely partnerships with research and development institutions with foreign partners would be quite important here. And lastly, social culture. That's a very important part for this hotspot area because we would need to promote the idea within the society that we don't need to dispose components, but instead really bring them back into the cycle for which a lot of awareness and capacity building and upskilling would need to happen. And I pause here for a moment to go to the Menti poll. And similarly, let's select up to 3 key obstacles for promoting material recovery and reuse in Thailand and EEC zone. And we can already see some results. Thank you very much for projecting those. So the most popular answer was the lack of comprehensive policies and incentives, followed by lack of business models for promotion of end-of-life and material recovery, and then limited number of MRO players in the market, and especially in the aviation industry. And other barriers have been mentioned as well. But as you can see here, yes, policies and incentives have been put up front as the most critical barrier important for this hotspot. Thank you. And I suggest we go back to the slides. So we spoke about key obstacles and some areas where Thailand is already doing good. Let's move on to the investment strategy promotion framework. And again, similarly to the last session, let's move on. Let's look at this bottom up to see where we want to be and then what needs to happen to get us there. So in terms of design for circularity, how we can actually design our systems to allow for extended lifetime as well as for the recycling of components. Well, we would like to have more focus on modular and reconfigurable interiors for aircrafts, for example. In this way, we can reuse them for newer crafts again. We would like to drive towards increasing the lifespan of products, and we would like to reduce dependency on new materials, parts and components, making it possible to again and again and again reuse components from the previous models. What is needed to get us there? Well, it would be very interesting to focus more on additive manufacturing to reduce waste and energy use through this process and, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. It would be very important to define fiscal instruments to increase the relative cost of new parts as compared to reusing old parts and making, again, the infrastructure in place, making those old parts available on the market. We would like to enable increased availability of second-hand parts for MRO in particular, and promote design optimization to increase structural efficiency. So making our products designed in a way so they, from the very start, are meant to be reused going forward as their components. The second one is rethink business model. So first we talked about design. The second is how we make business model conducive in Thailand for the end-of-life extension and recycling. So we would like to expand players in MRO sector and create more partnerships. As of now in Thailand, there are actually only 7 active players in MRO, which is not enough. But the new initiatives are appearing on the market, so it would be very, very important to promote those. Refurbishing parts to reset fatigue, reduce waste, and eliminate reuse of parts. and extending MRO networks for localized supply chain, repair and maintenance services. And to get us there, we would like to support local manufacturing and invest into scaled up certification of manufacturers of components, strengthen tier 2 and tier 3 manufacturing, but also moving gradually towards tier 1 production here for MRO parts. And again, strategically reduce virgin new components, shifting towards reused parts. Collaboration is another very important element here. I mentioned already the importance of international collaboration for this hotspot in particular, where we cannot just do it with our own efforts. You really need to collaborate with international aircraft. You really need to collaborate with international producers as well as international R&D firms, because they have already a lot more knowledge and experience to share with Thailand. We obviously need to expand on the infrastructure and do more training programs to increase capacities and skills here in Thailand for MRO and other areas for the lifetime expansion and the recycling. And the last one is technical enablement, where we talk about the more advanced technologies in place and digital solutions as well that would help us find information and monitor the market of the recycled parts. I'll pause here for a similar mentor session where I would like to ask you to vote for the most important parts of the circular economy promotion strategy for this component. And I can see again that quite diverse answers across different strategic elements. The most popular one is support local manufacturers to invest and scale up as certified manufacturers of components, followed by enable increased availability of second-hand parts for MRO and opportunities to expand MRO services, including building network across tier 1 to 3 parts manufacturers. But all other more or less were mentioned as well. So that means that we are on the right track. Let's move on. We have just a few slides to cover. All right, the action plan. And again, we have three-phased approach here, as well as different types of actions. Starting from technological support, what we feel would be important is in the midterm to establish Thailand's MRO value chain and engage more tier 2, 3, but also 1 parts manufacturers and extend via international partnerships and joint ventures, as well as build capacities and training of local staff that would be able to support MRO services and manufacturing. To get us there, we also need supportive policies and regulatory framework as a whole. That would be to support MRO services in respect to adoption circular economy principles. So again, bringing us back to the Japan example that we saw before, restrictions, for example, on disposal of components, promotion of recycling and more circular services, and making them commercially more attractive as compared to use of new parts. In the midterm, we would like to see policies and fiscal instruments to increase relative cost of new parts as compared to the use of recycled components. Next, adoptive policies and incentives to promote use of additive manufacturing to reduce waste and energy use and enhance repair potential. This is a very interesting area and potentially very interesting for investments. Before it may become live, we would also need to develop supporting policies and regulatory instruments. And in terms of digitalization, a very interesting area of action for us in the midterm, with some preliminary measures even before that, would be to develop digital online platform for EEC zone to support MRO industries with tracking and monitoring of used components to see how they have been so first of all, to source them and then to see how they have been used in the processes going forward. All right, and the last Métis for this hotspot, and we would need to prioritize actions. And I believe you have already completed it and we can see the results. Okay, so the first priority that has been mentioned by the majority of the participants is adoptive policies and incentives to promote use of additive manufacturing. That's very interesting because the action itself we put as the midterm, but in your opinion, it has to be brought forward already as a short term so that we can see results after, as soon as possible. Then we can see on the second place as promotion of policies and fiscal instruments for MRO and creation of sustainable and circular value chains for this. Followed by MRO policy on circular economy principles and MRO industrial line platform. Well, thank you very much. I'm personally quite surprised with the first choice, but that's a very good point for us to probably bring this action item forward towards short term. All right. We can bring slides back, please. Thank you very much. And the last slide for this hotspot and for our sector is what's next. So what are the main success factors and areas that we would like to focus on going forward for the extension of lifetime as well as for the recycling? From the policy perspective is reduction of barriers to investments within EEC and increase foreign investments in this hotspot, as well as the increased efficiency of patent laws. For partnerships, we would like to see them more, for sure, and including partnerships with foreign companies and organizations. Processes, adopting new technologies to enhance MRO industries, and simplifying bureaucratic procedures in Thailand to expedite permits. From the business strategy perspective, we would like to see modernizing Thailand's aviation industry and building relationships with regional players. On the infrastructure side, upskilling existing human resources within aviation industry and MRO industry, using new technologies. On technology innovation, driving intellectual property rights and strengthening automation and robotization, linking it as also to robotics industry. And on the supply chain side, incentivizing the localization of MRO supply chain within EEC. With this, I will close this session, and let's see if we have any pending questions before we can move to the lunch break.
ค่ะสำหรับช่วงนี้นะคะท่านไหนที่มีคำถามนะคะทางช่องทางออนไลน์ค่ะสามารถที่จะพิมพ์คำถามของคุณมาที่ช่องทางแชทได้เลยค่ะแล้วก็ถ้าสำหรับผู้เข้าร่วมงานในวันนี้มีคำถามนะคะเรียนเชิญที่บริเวณโพเดียมด้านนี้ได้เลยค่ะมาแล้วนะคะขออนุญาตเรียนเชิญค่ะ
Okay, Julia. This is from one of the participants. He said it's not a question, but just a comment on material recovery facilities are mostly SMEs. And pollution control is just written in the official documents, but not really enforced. So, for example, look at the water discharge from plastic recycling facility.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and also brings us back to the idea of policies and incentives to ban certain things and to incentivize more circular and low carbon behavior. And making those types of technologies and processes also commercially more interesting for the companies, including for SMEs.
So last but not least, would you like to say something to the audience here or from online platform?
Well, thank you very much for being our audience today. Once again, it's been our first hybrid event since a long time, so it's our pleasure. And especially I would like to thank EECO for this great opportunity to work together in the past month for this exciting project. And enjoy your meal, I guess. ขอบคุณมากค่ะ
ขอบคุณมากค่ะ และนี่คือเซสชันของคุณยูเลียนนะคะพาร์ทเนอร์จาก ERM นั่นเองค่ะ ช่วงนี้ค่ะเราจะพักรับประทานอาหารกลางวันกันนะคะ1ชั่วโมงค่ะแล้วเราจะกลับมาพบกันอีก1ครั้งค่ะช่วงเวลา 13 นาฬิกาตรงค่ะเพื่อรับฟังประเด็นที่น่าสนใจกันต่อในช่วงภาคบ่ายนั่นเองค่ะขอบพระคุณทุกท่านที่ติดตามนะคะและเดี๋ยวเรากลับมาพบกันในช่วง 13 นาฬิกาตรงค่ะสวัสดีค่ะค่ะแล้วขออนุญาตประชาสัมพันธ์นะคะสำหรับผู้ที่เข้าร่วมงานออนไซต์นะคะหรือว่าอยู่บริเวณในห้องสัมมนาขณะนี้ค่ะเรียนเชิญทุกท่านค่ะรับประทานอาหารกลางวันพร้อมกันร่วมกันที่บริเวณห้อง Kitchen Table ค่ะตั้งอยู่บริเวณชั้น2นะคะถ้าออกจากห้องบอลลูมของเราไปแล้วสามารถเลี้ยวขวาค่ะแล้วลงบันไดไปได้เลยค่ะ1ชั้นถึงได้เลยนะคะสำหรับ The Kitchen Table ค่ะห้องอาหารของเราตอนนี้เตรียมพร้อมรอต้อนรับทุกท่านแล้วนะคะและเดี๋ยวเรากลับมาพบกันในช่วงเวลา 13 นาฬิกาตรงค่ะขอบพระคุณค่ะ